Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The Hartwell farmhouse had been empty for 3 years when I got the call. Mrs. Hartwell wanted the whole place wired for smart automation before her son moved back from the city. Motion sensors, smart thermostats, automated lighting, the works. Easy money for a 2-week job, and the isolation didn't bother me. I'd done plenty of rural installations before. What bothered me was how the house felt like it was watching. The first day went smoothly enough. I started with the main floor, running cable through the basement and up into the walls. The house had good bones, solid oak beams, thick plaster walls that would muffle sound nicely once everything was buttoned up. The renovation crew had done quality work before moving on to their next project. Fresh drywall, new electrical panels, modern HVAC ducting, snaking through the ceiling spaces. I installed the first batch of motion sensors in the living room and kitchen, syncing them to my tablet as I worked. The familiar blue lights blinked to life, each sensor connecting to the network with a soft chime. By evening, I had 6 sensors online and responding normally. That night, alone in my motel room 20 minutes down the county road, I reviewed the day's data logs. Everything looked clean. Normal activation patterns as I'd moved through the rooms. Proper signal strength. No false triggers. I closed the tablet, satisfied. The problem started on day 2. I arrived at the farmhouse just after sunrise. Coffee steaming in the truck's cup holder, ready to tackle the upstairs bedrooms. But when I checked my tablet, 3 sensors were showing active. Not unusual. Sometimes small animals or settling structures could trigger them. I walked through the house, checking each room. Empty. Silent. I reset the sensors and watched them return to standby mode. By lunch, they were active again. This time I moved more carefully through the house, watching my tablet as I went. The sensor in the kitchen showed clear. The living room sensor showed clear. But the hallway sensor, the one I'd mounted just outside the bathroom, was registering movement when I was standing 10 feet away in the kitchen. I stared at the empty hallway. Afternoon sunlight slanted through the windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted lazily in the still air. Nothing moved. Nothing breathed. But the sensor insisted something was there. I grabbed my voltage tester and popped the sensor off its mount. The wiring looked perfect. Clean connections, proper gauge wire, no signs of interference. I remounted it and tested again. The moment I stepped away, it triggered. "Piece of shit," I muttered, the first words I'd spoken aloud in the house. The sound felt strange in the empty space. Too sharp, too human. By the 3rd day, I was questioning my own competence. 4 more sensors installed, and now 6 of them were showing intermittent activation patterns that made no sense. I'd spent hours checking connections, replacing sensors, even running new cable to eliminate the possibility of electrical interference. Nothing helped. The activations weren't random, though. That's what started to unnerve me. They followed patterns. Sensor A would trigger, then B, then C, as if something was moving deliberately from room to room. But when I traced those paths, they led through solid walls. On the 4th morning, I decided to check the crawl spaces. The farmhouse had been built in sections over several decades, leaving a maze of accessible areas between floors and behind walls. I grabbed my headlamp and toolkit and squeezed through the access panel in the utility room. The space was tight, maybe 3 feet high, but clean. The renovation crew had been thorough, leaving behind only a few scraps of old insulation and some abandoned wire nuts. I followed my sensor cables through the maze, checking connections junction by junction. Everything looked perfect, but as I worked deeper into the space, my headlamp began picking up something strange in the wooden framework. Scratches, deep gouges in the support beams, too regular to be from construction tools, too deliberate to be accidental. They ran parallel to the floor joists, disappearing into the darkness ahead of me. I followed them, my knees protesting against the rough plywood subflooring. The scratches led to a section where the insulation had been disturbed. Not removed, disturbed, pushed aside as if something had squeezed through. Beyond that point, I found the first tunnel. It was crude but purposeful, burrowing through the loose insulation and down into the crawl space proper, maybe 18 inches wide, following the path of least resistance between floor joists. I shined my light down its length but couldn't see the end. My rational mind offered explanations. Raccoons, maybe, or opossums. Rural properties were full of them, and they were notorious for making themselves at home in warm, dry spaces. But the scratches were wrong for claws, and the tunnel was too uniform, too intentional. I backed out of the crawl space and stood in the utility room, brushing dust and insulation from my clothes. The house felt different now, heavier, as if the walls themselves were pressing inward. That afternoon, I found my tools had been moved. Not lost, moved. My wire strippers, which I'd left on the kitchen counter, were now sitting on the windowsill 6 feet away. My voltage tester had migrated from the top of my toolbox to the floor beside it. Small movements, the kind you might dismiss as forgetfulness if they happened once or twice. But they kept happening. I started paying attention, making mental notes of where I placed things. Screwdriver on the left side of the counter, level against the north wall. Drill bit in the small compartment of my case. And one by one, they moved. Never far. Never lost. Just relocated. By the end of the week, the sensor readings had become completely unreliable. Motion detected in empty rooms, phantom movement behind walls, temperature fluctuations that didn't correspond to any environmental factors I could identify. I started documenting everything, taking photos and screenshots, building a case for equipment failure that would justify replacing the entire sensor array. But late at night, reviewing the data in my motel room, I noticed something else. The audio logs. Most motion sensors didn't record sound. They were purely optical or infrared devices. But the smart home system Mrs. Hartwell had requested included environmental monitoring, which meant microphones in several key locations. I'd installed them as part of the package, but hadn't paid much attention to their output. I should have. The first sound I found was from Tuesday night, recorded by the kitchen microphone at 2:17 a.m. A soft scratching, like fingernails on wood. It lasted maybe 10 seconds before cutting off. I played it back 3 times, adjusting the audio levels, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. Wednesday night brought more sounds, shuffling, something dragging across the floor above the kitchen. The microphone in the hallway caught what sounded like whispered conversation, too muffled to make out words. Thursday night, the whispers became clearer. Day more space. The voice was thin, distant, like someone speaking through several layers of cloth. I enhanced the audio as much as my software would allow, but the words remained just at the edge of comprehension. Need more space. So cramped. He doesn't understand. I sat in my motel room, laptop open on the narrow desk, replaying those whispers until the words lost all meaning. Outside, traffic moved along the county road. The normal sounds of a normal world, where motion sensors detected motion, and walls were solid, and voices didn't seep up from empty spaces beneath the floor. But inside the farmhouse, something was asking for more space. Friday morning, I made a decision that felt both necessary and foolish. I was going to open up the ceiling. The access point was in the main hallway, hidden behind a narrow panel that the renovation crew had installed for utility access. I'd been putting off checking the upper crawl space, but the scratching sounds from Wednesday night had come from directly above this spot. I positioned my ladder and removed the panel with a cordless screwdriver. The space beyond was dark and cramped, maybe 2 feet of clearance between the ceiling joists and the roofline. I clicked on my headlamp and pulled myself up. The smell hit me first. Not decay, nothing that dramatic or obvious. Just mustiness and something else. Something organic and warm, like an animal den. I crawled forward, following the main beam toward the center of the house. My headlamp revealed the expected maze of HVAC ducts and electrical conduit, but also something unexpected. More tunnels. These were larger than the ones I'd found in the lower crawl space, more sophisticated. They wove between the structural members with an intelligence that spoke of careful planning. Some followed the ductwork for long stretches before branching off on their own paths. Others seemed to prioritize stealth, taking circuitous routes that avoided the main support beams entirely. I followed the largest tunnel toward what I thought was the master bedroom. It was slow going. The space was tighter than the lower crawl area, and I had to move carefully to avoid putting my weight on the ceiling material below. 20 feet in, the tunnel opened into a wider area where several paths converged. Someone, or something, had been living here. The space had been hollowed out between three major support beams, creating a cavity large enough for a person to sit upright. The insulation had been carefully arranged to form walls, and scraps of cloth created a crude but functional nest. Empty water bottles were stacked in one corner alongside what looked like packages of crackers and energy bars. But it was the walls that made my hands shake. Scratched into the exposed wooden beams were marks. Not random gouges this time, but deliberate symbols. Stick figures, maybe, or maps. Lines connecting circles, with X's marking specific spots, and words, carved deep enough to catch the light from my headlamp. More space need, more space too small, let me out, make room. I backed away from the nest, trying to process what I was seeing. Someone had been living in the ceiling of the farmhouse. Someone who had been there long enough to carve an entire manifesto into the support beams. Someone who was still there, based on the fresh food wrappers and the damp smell of recent habitation. That's when I heard the scratching behind me. I spun around, my headlamp beam sweeping across the tunnel I'd just crawled through. For a moment, I saw nothing but shadows and insulation. Then the beam caught movement, something pale and quick, disappearing around a bend in the tunnel. I started backing toward the access panel, moving as quietly as I could while still making progress. The scratching continued, following me, staying just outside the reach of my light. Not the random scrabbling of an animal, but the deliberate movement of something that understood pursuit and evasion. My hands found the access panel just as my light revealed a face. It was human, gaunt and pale, with eyes that reflected the LED beam like an animal's. But it was also wrong somehow, distorted by the cramped space and the harsh light and my own terror. The features seemed to shift and blur, never quite resolving into something I could process or remember clearly. I dropped through the access panel and onto my ladder so fast that I nearly fell. The screwdriver was in my hand before I'd consciously decided to pick it up, and I was replacing the panel screws with fingers that shook so badly I stripped two of them. Above me, the scratching continued. I left the farmhouse that afternoon and called Mrs. Hartwell from my truck, parked at the end of the long gravel driveway. I explained that the sensor installation was taking longer than expected due to electrical interference issues. I needed to order some specialty shielding equipment, which would delay completion by at least a week. She was understanding, even apologetic about the old house's quirks. I promised to call when the new equipment arrived and hung up, before she could ask any follow-up questions. I didn't go back to the farmhouse for 3 days. When I finally returned, I found my tool case open on the kitchen counter. Every compartment had been unlocked and examined. Nothing was missing, but everything had been moved slightly, as if someone had been conducting a detailed inventory. A note was propped against my voltage tester, written in cramped handwriting on the back of a fast food receipt. Thank you for making more space. The tunnels are much better now, but we still need room to grow. I checked the ceiling access panel. The screws I'd stripped were gone, replaced with new ones that gleamed like fresh chrome. The panel itself had been painted over, sealing it shut with what looked like several coats of primer. My sensor readings were perfect now. Every device responded normally, triggering only when I moved through their detection zones. The audio logs were clean, no scratching, no whispers, no sounds that shouldn't exist in an empty house. But sometimes, when I worked alone in the quiet rooms, I could feel eyes watching from behind the walls. And when I moved my tools from one location to another, they were always in slightly different positions when I came back. I finished the installation in 2 more days, testing each system thoroughly before packing up my equipment. Everything worked exactly as designed. Mrs. Hartwell was delighted with the results when I demonstrated the smartphone controls and explained the monitoring features. As I loaded my truck for the final time, I noticed that the kitchen window was slightly open. Just a crack, maybe an inch or two. Not enough to be obvious, but enough to let air circulate. Enough to provide ventilation to the spaces between the walls. I closed the window and locked it, but when I looked back from my truck, it was open again. I drove away without checking it a second time. 3 weeks later, Mrs. Hartwell called to thank me again and to ask a question. Her son had moved into the farmhouse and was having some issues with the motion sensors. Nothing serious, just occasional false alarms in the middle of the night. The system would show movement in the hallway or kitchen when he was asleep upstairs. She wondered if I could stop by and take a look. I told her I was booked solid for the next 2 months, but I'd be happy to recommend another technician. Someone who specialized in troubleshooting smart home systems. Someone who would know what to look for. I never asked if her son had noticed any other problems with the house. Whether he'd heard scratching in the walls or found his belongings moved around. Whether he'd discovered the access panel in the hallway ceiling, or noticed the smell of something living just out of sight. I never asked because I didn't want to know the answer. Sometimes, late at night in my own home, I think about those tunnels branching through the farmhouse like capillaries through living tissue. I think about the careful way the tool compartments were opened and examined, and the intelligence required to replace stripped screws with new ones. I think about the note and its promise that they still needed room to grow. And sometimes, when I'm working alone in crawl spaces and ceiling voids, I find myself listening for the sound of scratching just beyond the reach of my headlamp, waiting for whispered voices asking for more space, wondering if the things that live between the walls of old houses ever migrate to new locations, wondering if they follow the people who discover their secrets, wondering if the scratching I sometimes hear in my own walls is just the house settling, or something else entirely. Something that learned about the spaces between spaces and decided they weren't quite big enough yet. Story 2. The first time I heard them, I thought it was just another sleepless night playing tricks on my mind. I'd been living above Castellano's old auto body shop for 3 months when the sound started. The landlord had mentioned the place had been empty for years, something about the previous tenant leaving suddenly, but the rent was cheap enough that I didn't ask questions. The flat was sparse but functional, hardwood floors that creaked with each step, windows that rattled when trucks passed, and thin walls that seemed to absorb the city's ambient noise during the day, only to amplify every whisper after dark. It was a Tuesday when I first noticed the clock on my nightstand glowing 11:13 p.m., the red digits burning against the darkness of my bedroom. That's when the horns began. Not the sharp, aggressive blare of modern car horns, but something deeper, more resonant, the kind of sound that seemed to carry weight and history. The notes lingered in the air, overlapping in a harmony that felt almost orchestrated. I pressed my face against the cold window glass, expecting to see traffic below, but the street lay empty under the amber glow of the streetlights. The smell hit me next. Old gasoline, rich and sweet, mixed with something else. Leather, maybe, or tobacco. It seeped through the window frames and filled my nostrils with such intensity that I could taste it on my tongue. The scent was so vivid, so immediate, that I found myself checking the stove, wondering if I'd left something burning. Then came the laughter. It drifted up from the street like smoke, carried on a melody I couldn't quite place. Big band music, all brass and swing, with voices that seemed to echo from a different era entirely. The laughter was warm, genuine, the kind you hear at parties where everyone knows each other's names and the night feels infinite with possibility. I grabbed my robe and stepped onto the small balcony that overlooked the intersection. The music grew louder, more distinct, but the street remained stubbornly empty. No cars, no people, just the usual collection of parked vehicles that never seemed to move. Yet the sounds continued, as if emerging from the asphalt itself. That's when I saw the lights. Yellow headlights, dim and diffused, appeared at the far end of the street. They moved slowly, deliberately, casting long shadows that seemed to bend in impossible directions. As they drew closer, I could make out the shapes behind them. Cars, certainly, but with the rounded fenders and elongated hoods of vehicles from another time. The convoy moved in single file, each car following the other with precision, their chrome bumpers catching fragments of streetlight that shouldn't have been there. I leaned forward, gripping the balcony railing, trying to get a better look. The cars were beautiful in their antiquity, Packards, I thought, though I'd never been much of a car enthusiast. Their paint jobs gleamed despite the darkness, deep blues and forest greens that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the light around them. The drivers were little more than silhouettes, but I could see them clearly enough to notice their hats, the way they sat upright and formal behind their steering wheels. The convoy reached the intersection directly below my balcony and continued straight, heading toward what I knew was a dead end. I'd walked that way during my first week in the neighborhood, discovering that the street terminated in a brick wall where a building expansion had claimed the old roadway decades ago. Yet the cars showed no sign of slowing down. As the last vehicle approached the wall, I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable collision. Instead, the entire convoy simply faded, the lights dimming to nothing, the sounds trailing off like a radio being slowly turned down. The street returned to its normal silence, leaving me standing alone on the balcony with the taste of old gasoline still lingering in my mouth. I convinced myself it was a dream. The next night at 11:13 p.m., it happened again. This time I was ready, positioned by the window with a clear view of the street. The horns began on schedule, followed by the sweet petroleum scent and the distant swing music. The yellow lights appeared as if materializing from the darkness itself, and again the phantom convoy made its impossible journey to the dead end. But something was different. As the cars passed beneath my window, I heard voices more clearly. Someone called out. Not to me, exactly, but in my general direction. The words were indistinct, muffled by the music and the rumble of engines, but the tone was unmistakably friendly, inviting. By the fourth night, I couldn't ignore the pattern any longer. I started keeping a notebook, documenting each appearance with scientific precision. The time never varied, always 11:13 p.m. exactly. The route remained constant. The cars were always the same models, always in the same order, always carrying the same shadowy passengers. What changed was my response to them. I found myself looking forward to 11:13 p.m., organizing my evenings around that 13-minute window when the street came alive with impossible activity. I stopped closing the windows, wanting to hear every note of the music, every nuance of the voices. The smell of old gasoline became comforting rather than strange, a familiar companion in the darkness. It was during my second week of observations that I decided to research the history of the intersection. The local library's newspaper archives were extensive, if poorly organized, and I spent hours scrolling through microfiche until I found what I was looking for. The headline was buried on page 3 of the October 15, 1926 edition of the city paper, "Collector's Race Ends in Tragedy." The article described an informal competition between members of the exclusive Packard Automobile Club, men who gathered every Thursday night to showcase their prized vehicles. What had started as friendly rivalry had escalated into an impromptu race through the city streets, ending at the intersection below my current apartment. The details were sparse, but the article mentioned that the race had been organized hastily, without proper safety measures or crowd control. The drivers, described as prominent local businessmen and automotive enthusiasts, had been racing their finest Packards through a course that ended at what was then a major crossroads. The tragedy wasn't specified in detail. The newspaper's language was delicate, appropriate for the era, but it was clear that something catastrophic had occurred at that exact intersection. I found myself returning to the library day after day, searching for follow-up articles, obituaries, anything that might explain what had happened that night in 1926. The trail was frustratingly cold. After the initial report, the incident seemed to vanish from the public record, as if the city had collectively decided to forget. But the phantom convoy hadn't forgotten. My observations became more detailed, more personal. I began to recognize individual cars within the procession. The midnight blue Packard 8 with its distinctive chrome trim, the forest green convertible whose top was always down despite the October chill, the burgundy sedan whose driver always wore what appeared to be a bowler hat. I started naming them in my notebook, assigning personalities based on their driving styles and the glimpses I caught of their occupants. The voices grew clearer with each passing night. I began to understand that they were calling to me specifically, not just making general conversation among themselves. The invitations became more direct, more insistent. "Come down," they seemed to say. "Join us for a drive." I started spending more time on the balcony, arriving earlier each night, sometimes standing outside for hours before the convoy appeared. The neighbors began to notice. Mrs. Chen from the apartment across the street started closing her curtains when she saw me watching. The night security guard from the office building next door began including my balcony in his regular patrols, his flashlight beam occasionally sweeping across my position. I didn't care. The midnight convoy was the most interesting thing that had happened to me in years, possibly ever. My day job at the insurance company felt increasingly surreal compared to the vivid reality of those 13 minutes each night. I found myself making excuses to leave work early, canceling social plans, structuring my entire existence around that single moment when the impossible became routine. It was on a Thursday night, exactly 1 month after my first sighting, that I noticed the empty space in the convoy. The procession appeared as usual at 11:13 p.m., but something was different. Between the midnight blue Packard 8 and the forest green convertible, there was a gap. Not just empty space, but a deliberate absence, as if one of the cars had simply chosen not to appear. The gap was precisely the right size for a vehicle, and as the convoy passed beneath my balcony, I could swear I heard an engine running where no car existed. The voices were clearer that night, more urgent. The invitation was unmistakable. "Your spot is ready," they called. "Come down, come join us." I gripped the balcony railing, my knuckles white against the metal. The rational part of my mind insisted this was all elaborate self-deception, a stress response to the isolation of living alone in a new city. But the convoy was so vivid, so consistent, so real in every sensory detail, that I couldn't dismiss it as mere hallucination. The empty space in the procession felt like an accusation, a reminder of some appointment I'd forgotten to keep. I began researching the building's history, trying to understand why I was experiencing these visions. The auto body shop below had been operating since the 1940s, built on the foundation of an earlier structure that had been demolished in 1927. I couldn't find records of what had occupied the space before the demolition, but the timing was suspicious. My sleep became increasingly erratic. I would lie in bed, fully dressed, waiting for 11:13 p.m. Even when I tried to ignore the nightly appearances, the sounds would penetrate the walls, the smell would seep through the floorboards, and I would find myself drawn to the window despite my best efforts to resist. The empty space in the convoy appeared every night now, a void that seemed to pull at me with increasing intensity. The voices grew more personal, more familiar, as if they knew things about me that I'd never shared with anyone. "You belong with us," they insisted. "You've always belonged with us." I started having dreams about driving, though I'd never owned a car in the city. In these dreams, I was behind the wheel of a beautiful Packard, the steering wheel smooth and warm beneath my hands, the engine purring with mechanical perfection. I drove through streets that existed nowhere in the modern city, past buildings that had been demolished decades before my birth, toward destinations that felt more like memories than plans. The dreams were so vivid that I would wake with the sensation of motion still coursing through my body, the phantom pressure of a gas pedal beneath my foot. It was a Tuesday night when I finally understood what they wanted from me. The convoy appeared as usual, but this time the empty space wasn't just a gap. It was a presence, a shadow car that existed just beyond the edge of perception. I could see its outline in the negative space between the other vehicles, could hear the distinct note of its engine harmonizing with the rest of the procession. As the phantom car passed directly beneath my balcony, it stopped. The other vehicles continued their journey toward the dead end, but the invisible car remained stationary in the street, its engine idling with mechanical patience. I could feel the driver looking up at me, though I couldn't see his face. The invitation was no longer spoken, it was simply understood, a communication that bypassed language entirely. All I had to do was come down, step off the balcony, into the street, and claim my place in the convoy. The thought filled me with a longing so intense it was almost physical pain. I found myself climbing over the balcony railing before I'd consciously decided to move. My bare feet found purchase on the fire escape ladder, and I began my descent toward the street. The sounds of the convoy grew louder as I climbed down, the music more distinct, the voices more welcoming. The asphalt was warm beneath my feet despite the October chill. I could smell leather and tobacco now, could hear individual conversations among the phantom passengers. Someone was telling a joke about a Stutz bear cat, and the resulting laughter was rich and genuine. I approached the empty space in the convoy, and as I did, the car began to materialize around me. Not gradually, but all at once, as if it had been waiting for my presence to become real. The interior was exactly as I'd dreamed it. Burgundy leather seats, walnut dashboard, instruments that glowed with warm amber light. I slid behind the steering wheel, and the car felt like home. The convoy began to move again, and I moved with them. We drove through the city as it had been nearly a century ago, past buildings that existed now only in photographs, through intersections that had been reconfigured by decades of urban planning. The other drivers nodded to me as we drove, their faces familiar despite the fact that I'd never seen them clearly before. We drove for what felt like hours, though the clock on my dashboard remained frozen at 11:13. The route was complex but purposeful, a grand tour of a city that no longer existed, ending always at the same intersection where everything had begun and ended on a Thursday night in 1926. As we approached the final turn, I began to understand what would happen next. The convoy would reach the dead end, and we would all... what? Disappear? Crash? Transform into something else entirely? I pressed my foot to the brake, bringing my car to a gentle stop. The other vehicles continued forward without me, their passengers turning to look back with expressions of disappointment and understanding. They had been waiting for me to join them, but they wouldn't force me to complete the journey. The phantom car faded around me, and I found myself standing alone in the street, watching the yellow headlights disappear into the brick wall that marked the end of the road. I climbed back up to my apartment and sat on the balcony, waiting to see if the convoy would return. But the street remained empty, and 11:13 p.m. came and went without ceremony. They haven't appeared since that night. I still live above the auto body shop, still organize my evenings around that 13-minute window when the impossible might happen. Sometimes I think I catch the faint scent of old gasoline, or hear a distant note of brass music, but it might just be my imagination. The rational part of my mind insists that none of it was real, that I experienced some kind of extended psychological episode brought on by stress and isolation. But I can't shake the feeling that I made a choice that night, and that choice has consequences I don't yet understand. Sometimes when I'm lying in bed in the hours before dawn, I wonder what would have happened if I'd stayed in the car, if I'd completed that final drive to whatever destination awaited at the end of the road. Would I have found answers to questions I didn't know I was asking? Would I have discovered some truth about the nature of time and memory, and the thin boundaries between what was, what is, and what might still be? The empty space in the convoy was meant for me, of that much I'm certain. But whether I was meant to fill it or leave it empty, I'll never know. What I do know is that every night at 11:13 p.m. I'm still listening for the sound of horns in the distance, still watching for yellow lights that might materialize from the darkness. The invitation was extended once, and though I declined it, I can't escape the feeling that it remains open. I just have to decide whether I'm brave enough or foolish enough to accept it. Story 3. The first anomaly appeared at 0347 hours, somewhere over the gray expanse of the Atlantic. I was nursing my third cup of coffee in the bridge when Martinez called up from the cargo monitoring station, his voice carrying that particular strain of confusion that makes a first officer's stomach clench. The thermal imaging system had picked up a heat signature in Bay 7, a human form, clear as daylight on the infrared display. 22 degrees Celsius, the exact temperature of living flesh. The silhouette showed a thin figure, barefoot, moving with deliberate steps between the towering stacks of shipping containers. This was impossible for 3 reasons. First, Bay 7 was sealed and pressurized according to our manifest of temperature-sensitive pharmaceuticals. Second, the manifest showed no human cargo, living or otherwise. Third, I had personally checked the manifest seal before we departed Hamburg 47 hours ago. I descended to the cargo monitoring room, my footsteps echoing in the narrow corridors of the northern passage. The ship's hull groaned around us, a constant reminder of the ocean's pressure against our steel skin. Martinez stood before a bank of screens, his face illuminated by the green glow of thermal imagery. "There," he said, pointing to monitor 4. "Been walking around for the past 20 minutes." I watched the heat signature move with unhurried precision. The figure appeared to be examining the containers, pausing at certain intervals, occasionally reaching toward the metal surfaces. The thermal reading remained constant, a perfect human temperature in a space that should have been empty and cold. "Check the visible spectrum cameras," I ordered. Martinez's fingers danced across the keyboard. The screen flickered to standard visual monitoring of Bay 7. Rows of containers sat in perfect order, illuminated by harsh fluorescent strips. Nothing moved. No shadows shifted between the stacks. The space appeared utterly vacant. Switch back to thermal. The figure was still there, now crouched beside a blue container marked with biohazard symbols. As we watched, it stood and moved toward another stack, its movements fluid and purposeful. "Could be a sensor malfunction," Martinez suggested, but his voice lacked conviction. I knew it wasn't a malfunction. In 15 years of merchant marine service, I'd learned to trust the ship's systems more than my own eyes. The thermal imaging was military grade, installed after the incident with the Somali pirates 3 years back. It didn't lie. "I'm going down there," I announced. Martinez shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, protocol states that sealed bays shouldn't be breached during transit unless there's a security concern," I finished. "I'd say an impossible passenger qualifies." The journey to Bay 7 took me through the ship's intestinal corridors, past the constant rumble of engines and the occasional creak of metal under stress. The Northern Passage was a good ship, but she was old, and the Atlantic had a way of testing every rivet and weld. The fluorescent lights flickered intermittently, casting moving shadows that made me glance over my shoulder more than once. The access hatch to Bay 7 stood sealed, its electronic lock showing green. I punched in my override code and heard the pneumatic hiss as the pressure equalized. The heavy door swung open, revealing the cavernous space beyond. Cold air rushed out, carrying the sterile scent of pharmaceuticals and the metallic tang of pressurized atmosphere. I stepped inside, my flashlight beam cutting through the regulated twilight between the container stacks. "Hello?" My voice echoed off the steel walls, returning to me distorted and hollow. Silence answered back. I walked the same path I had watched the thermal figure take, checking each container, examining the floor for any sign of disturbance. The concrete deck showed nothing unusual, no footprints, no scuff marks, nothing to indicate human presence. But the air felt wrong. It carried a quality I couldn't name, a subtle thickness that made the hair on my arms stand up. The temperature was exactly what it should be for a climate-controlled bay, yet I found myself shivering. Every few steps, I caught the sensation of being watched, observed by unseen eyes from the shadows between containers. I completed the circuit and found nothing. No hidden person, no equipment malfunction, no rational explanation for what the thermal imaging had captured. I sealed the bay and returned to the monitoring station, where Martinez waited with obvious relief. "Find anything?" "Nothing," I replied, but continued watching the thermal display. The figure was gone. For the next 6 hours, I told myself it had been a sensor ghost, some quirk of electronics and electromagnetic interference. Ships were full of such anomalies: radar shadows, false sonar returns, radio signals that seemed to come from empty ocean. The Atlantic was particularly notorious for playing tricks on navigation equipment, but at 14:23 hours, it returned. This time, the thermal signature appeared in Bay 12, moving among containers of automotive parts bound for Boston. Same human-shaped heat pattern, same barefoot silhouette, same impossible presence in a sealed and secured space. I watched for 2 hours as the figure methodically explored every row of containers. It moved with the deliberate pace of someone conducting an inspection, occasionally pausing to examine particular cargo units. The pattern suggested intelligence, purpose, a methodical search for something specific. The visible spectrum cameras showed nothing but empty aisles and stacked metal. I found myself returning to Bay 12 3 times during my shift, each visit yielding the same result: empty space, undisturbed cargo, and the persistent feeling of invisible observation. The third time, I noticed that the air carried a different quality, a faint residual warmth that shouldn't have existed in the climate-controlled environment. That night, I lay in my bunk listening to the ship's rhythm and trying to rationalize what I had seen. The Northern Passage had carried thousands of tons of cargo across the Atlantic without incident. Our crew was experienced, our equipment reliable, our procedures flawless. There had to be a logical explanation for the thermal anomalies. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams of shadowy figures moving through endless corridors of containers, always just beyond the reach of visible light. The third day brought escalation. The thermal signature appeared in 3 different bays over the course of my watch. Bay 7 again, then Bay 15, then Bay 3. Each time, the figure followed the same methodical pattern of exploration. Each time, the visible cameras showed nothing but cargo and empty space. I began checking the bays obsessively, sometimes twice per shift. The crews noticed my frequent absences from the bridge, and I caught them exchanging glances when they thought I wasn't looking. Captain Rodriguez asked if I was feeling well, his concern barely concealing suspicion about my fitness for duty. I couldn't explain that I was chasing ghosts through the cargo holds. I couldn't describe the growing certainty that something was wrong with the ship, with the cargo, with the very fabric of reality in those sealed spaces below deck. By the 4th day, I had developed a theory that threatened my sanity. The figure wasn't searching the containers randomly. It was following a pattern, moving through specific bays in a sequence that suggested intimate knowledge of our cargo manifest. It spent longer periods examining containers marked with particular symbols: biohazard, radioactive, hazardous materials. The pharmaceutical containers in Bay 7, the experimental automotive batteries in Bay 12, the medical isotopes in Bay 15. The figure was systematically investigating our most sensitive cargo. On the 5th morning, we received our approach clearance for Boston Harbor. I stood on the bridge watching the Massachusetts coastline emerge from the pre-dawn gloom, feeling a mixture of relief and dread. Whatever was happening aboard the Northern Passage would soon be someone else's problem. But the ship had one final revelation waiting. During our final approach, the Port Authority requested a routine thermal scan of all cargo bays as part of their security protocol. I watched the displays with growing tension as our thermal imaging systems swept through each sealed compartment. Bay 7 showed the expected temperature readings for pharmaceutical storage. Bay 12 registered normal thermal patterns for automotive cargo. Bay 15 displayed the characteristic heat signatures of properly stored medical isotopes. Everything appeared normal until the scan reached Bay 21. The entire bay registered at exactly 22 degrees Celsius. Not just the figure, the entire space. Every container, every surface, every cubic meter of air glowed with the precise temperature of human flesh. The bay had somehow become a massive heat signature, a thermal reflection of living tissue. I stared at the display, my hands trembling as I reached for the radio to call the Port Authority. Before I could speak, Martinez grabbed my arm. "Sir, look at this." He had switched to the visible spectrum camera for Bay 21. The space appeared normal, containers stacked in regulation order, proper lighting, no signs of disturbance. But as I watched, something moved in the shadows between the stacks. Not the thermal figure I had been tracking, but something else. A darkness that seemed to flow like liquid, shifting and pooling in spaces where darkness shouldn't exist. "Are you seeing this?" I whispered. Martinez squinted at the screen. Seeing what, sir? The darkness was spreading, flowing between containers like spilled ink. It moved with purposeful direction, following the same paths the thermal figure had taken through other bays. As it moved, the thermal reading of Bay 21 began to fluctuate, dropping degree by degree until it matched the ambient temperature of the other cargo spaces. "There's nothing there, sir," Martinez said, genuine concern creeping into his voice. "Maybe you should take a break before we dock." I looked at the screen again. Bay 21 appeared completely normal. Proper lighting, organized cargo, no movement of any kind. The thermal reading had stabilized at the expected temperature for mixed freight. But I had seen something. I was certain of it. The docking process proceeded without incident. The Port Authority conducted their standard inspections, finding nothing unusual in any cargo bay. The manifest matched the reality perfectly. No unexpected heat signatures, no impossible passengers, no anomalies of any kind. As the ground crew began unloading procedures, I stood on the dock watching them work. The afternoon sun felt warm on my face after 5 days of artificial lighting and recycled air. Everything looked normal, routine, exactly as it should be. Then I noticed the footprints. They emerged from Bay 21's cargo door in a clear trail across the aluminum loading platform. Heat-impressed marks in the metal itself, as if someone with burning feet had walked from the sealed cargo space to the edge of the dock. The prints were precise and unmistakable. Bare human feet, size 9 or 10, pressed into the aluminum with impossible temperature. The trail ended at the intact seal of the cargo door. I called over the ground crew supervisor, a weathered man named Collins, who had been working the Boston docks for 20 years. He examined the marks with professional interest, running his fingers along the impressed metal. "Never seen anything like this," he admitted. "Looks like someone walked out of that container with feet hot enough to brand aluminum. But the seal's intact, and our thermal scanners didn't pick up anything unusual during unloading." I stared at the footprints, feeling the last threads of my rational worldview beginning to fray. The marks were real, physical evidence of something that couldn't exist. They led from a sealed space that had been under constant surveillance, yet no cameras had recorded anything leaving the bay. "Could be some kind of chemical reaction," Collins suggested. "Sometimes cargo shifts during transport, containers leak, chemicals mix in unexpected ways, creates all sorts of strange effects." I nodded, accepting his explanation because the alternative was unthinkable. But as I walked back to the ship for the final manifest review, I could feel the weight of invisible observation pressing against my shoulders. Something had traveled with us across the Atlantic, something that existed in the spaces between temperature and visibility, between detection and reality. The Northern Passage would sail again in 3 days, carrying a new cargo manifest to Hamburg. I would not be aboard for the return voyage. I submitted my resignation that evening, citing personal reasons and the need for extended shore leave. But sometimes, in the early hours of morning, I find myself studying thermal imaging systems on maritime job boards. I wonder about the spaces between what we can see and what we can measure, about passengers who travel in the margins of perception. And I wonder who, or what, is still out there, moving unseen through the cargo holds of ships crossing dark oceans, searching for something among the containers that we prefer to keep sealed and forgotten. The footprints were real. I have photographs, measurements, documentation that proves their existence. Yet every expert I've consulted offers rational explanations: heat transfer, chemical reactions, metal fatigue, optical illusions. They tell me that what I saw was impossible. They're probably right. But on quiet nights, when the wind carries the scent of salt air in distant shipping lanes, I can still feel those unseen eyes watching from the shadows between worlds. And I know that somewhere in the vastness of the Atlantic, impossible passengers continue their journeys aboard ships whose crews will never see them coming. The thermal signature remains constant at 22 degrees Celsius, the exact temperature of human flesh, alive and searching in the spaces we cannot see. Story 4. The rain began before I reached the old farmhouse. Fat drops that struck the windshield like accusatory fingers. I should have turned back then. Should have listened to the knot tightening in my stomach as the familiar dirt road stretched ahead. But the keys to my grandfather's property had been burning a hole in my pocket for 3 months, and the corporate headhunter's offer wouldn't wait much longer. I needed space to think. Distance from the city's suffocating expectations, and the weight of a decision that could reshape everything I thought I knew about my future. The farmhouse squatted against the darkening sky like an arthritic joint, its weather-beaten siding the color of old bones. I hadn't been here since the funeral 2 years ago. Hadn't wanted to face the emptiness that would greet me inside. But tonight, with rain drumming against the roof and wind rattling the shutters, emptiness seemed preferable to the alternative. The key stuck in the lock, protesting with a metallic screech that sent shivers down my spine. Inside, the air tasted stale and forgotten, thick with dust motes that danced in the beam of my flashlight. Everything remained exactly as Grandpa Joe had left it. His reading glasses folded on the kitchen table, a half-finished crossword puzzle beside them, his favorite coffee mug still bearing the ghost of a brown ring. I dropped my overnight bag by the door and fumbled for the light switch. The overhead bulb flickered to life, casting harsh shadows that seemed to breathe and shift in my peripheral vision. The familiar smell of the house, pipe tobacco, old wood, and something indefinably warm, wrapped around me like an embrace I wasn't sure I wanted. The job offer lay folded in my jacket pocket, crisp and official. Senior Marketing Director at Morrison & Associates, a position that would triple my salary and transplant me to Seattle. It was everything I'd worked toward, everything that should have made sense. Yet something about it felt wrong, like wearing a suit tailored for someone else's body. Thunder rolled across the sky as I made my way to the spare bedroom, the same room I'd slept in during childhood summers. The bed creaked under my weight, its ancient springs protesting with a symphony of metallic groans. Rain drummed against the window with increasing intensity, and I found myself counting the seconds between lightning flashes and thunder crashes, a habit left over from those long-ago visits when storms terrified me. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams I couldn't quite remember upon waking. But sometime deep in the night, I became aware of a sound that didn't belong. The soft scrape of footsteps on the front porch. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear over the rain. There it was again. Deliberate, measured steps that seemed to pause directly outside my window. My rational mind supplied a dozen explanations. A raccoon, a branch blown by the wind, the settling of old wood. But my body knew better, every muscle tensing as primitive instincts awakened. The footsteps moved to the front door. I slipped from bed and crept toward the living room, bare feet silent on the worn hardwood. Through the curtained window, I caught a glimpse of a shadow on the porch. Tall, familiar in a way that made my breath catch in my throat. The front door opened with its characteristic squeal. I should have called out, should have demanded to know who was there. Instead, I pressed myself against the wall and waited, heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The footsteps entered the house with the confidence of someone who belonged there, moving through the darkness with practiced ease. A match struck in the kitchen. The smell reached me first. That distinctive aroma of pipe tobacco, sweet and aromatic with hints of vanilla and cherry. It was Grandpa Joe's blend, the one he'd special ordered from a shop in Richmond until the day he'd quit smoking 3 months before his death. I peered around the corner. He sat at the kitchen table in his usual spot, the match's flame illuminating features I'd thought I'd never see again. Grandpa Joe looked exactly as he had in life. Silver hair neatly combed, flannel shirt buttoned to the collar, reading glasses perched on his nose. The only difference was the pipe between his lips, the same briarwood pipe he'd sworn to abandon when the doctor delivered his diagnosis. My legs threatened to give out beneath me. This couldn't be happening. I'd buried him myself, had felt the cold finality of dirt hitting his casket. Yet there he sat, as solid and present as the table beneath his folded hands. He spoke without looking up from his crossword puzzle, his voice carrying the same gravelly warmth I remembered from childhood bedtime stories. "You're going to take that job, aren't you?" The words hit me like a physical blow. Nobody knew about the Morrison and Associates offer except me and the headhunter. I hadn't told my parents, hadn't mentioned it to friends or colleagues. The confidentiality agreement I'd signed ensured that even discussing the position could jeopardize my candidacy. 7 across, he continued, tapping his pencil against the paper. Word for someone who abandons their true calling. Starts with T. I found my voice, though it emerged as barely more than a whisper. Grandpa? He finally looked up, and his eyes held the same gentle amusement they'd always carried when he caught me sneaking cookies before dinner. You always were too smart for your own good, Tommy. Even as a boy, you could see things others missed. Remember when you insisted there were faces in the wallpaper of your bedroom? Your mother thought you were being dramatic, but I knew better. The memory surfaced unbidden. Nights spent staring at the faded floral pattern in my childhood room, certain that hidden among the roses and vines were watching eyes and twisted mouths. Grandpa Joe had been the only one who'd listened, who'd taken my fears seriously enough to move me to a different room. This isn't real, I said, more to convince myself than him. You're dead. I watched them lower you into the ground. He drew deeply on his pipe, and I watched in fascination as the tobacco glowed without burning, emitting that impossibly sweet smoke that curled toward the ceiling like beckoning fingers. Real is a funny word, Tommy. Real is that fear in your chest when you think about taking a job that'll hollow you out from the inside. Real is the way you've been lying awake nights, wondering if success is worth becoming someone you don't recognize. How could he know these things? The insomnia, the mounting anxiety about accepting a position that felt like selling my soul for a paycheck. I hadn't confided these fears to anyone. The Morrison job will pay well, he continued, returning to his crossword. Corner office, company car, all the trappings of a life well lived. But you'll spend your days selling products you don't believe in to people who don't need them. You'll watch yourself disappear piece by piece until what's left fits perfectly into their corporate mold. The pipe smoke drifted toward me, carrying that cloying sweetness that seemed to bypass my nose and settle directly in my brain. It was hypnotic, almost narcotic in its intensity, and I found myself taking an involuntary step closer. Traitor, he said suddenly, startling me. That's 7 across, someone who abandons their true calling. I don't understand what you want from me. He set down his pencil and fixed me with those knowing eyes. I want you to remember who you used to be. Before the business degree, before the suit and tie became your uniform. You used to write stories, Tommy. You used to stay up all night crafting worlds that felt more real than the one outside your window. Another suppressed memory surfaced. Countless hours spent at this very table, scribbling in notebooks while Grandpa Joe worked his crosswords nearby. I'd written fantasy epics and science fiction adventures, stories about heroes who chose courage over comfort, who followed their hearts even when the path led somewhere uncertain. That was kid stuff, I said, though the words felt hollow even as I spoke them. I grew up. I got practical. Practical. He spoke the word like it tasted bitter. Is that what you call abandoning your dreams? The smoke grew thicker, more oppressive, and I realized the room was becoming difficult to breathe in. The sweet aroma that had seemed pleasant moments before now cloyed at my throat like syrup, making me lightheaded and nauseous. The local newspaper in Morrison's hometown is looking for a features writer, Grandpa Joe said, his voice seeming to come from a great distance. It pays a fraction of what the corporate job offers, but you'd be writing again, really writing. Not marketing copy or quarterly reports, but stories that matter. How could he possibly know about that position? I'd seen the listing myself just 2 days ago, buried deep in an online job board. The salary was laughably small, barely enough to cover rent in most places. It was exactly the kind of opportunity my practical side had learned to dismiss without a second thought. The pipe smoke continued to curl upward, forming shapes that seemed almost recognizable in my increasingly dizzy state. Faces, perhaps, or words written in a language I couldn't quite decipher. Your grandmother used to say that the dead can't rest when their loved ones are making terrible mistakes, he said, rising from his chair with the same careful movements I remembered from his later years. Of course, She also believed in reading tea leaves and talking to houseplants, so take that for what it's worth. He moved toward me, and I caught the full force of that impossibly sweet smoke. It was overwhelming now, sickening in its intensity, and I stumbled backward until my shoulders hit the wall. The choice is yours, Tommy. It always has been. But remember, some doors, once you walk through them, don't have handles on the other side. He was close enough now that I could see the details of his face, the familiar scar on his chin from a childhood accident, the way his left eye was slightly smaller than his right, the constellation of age spots across his cheekbones. He looked completely, undeniably real, yet when he exhaled, no breath disturbed the air between us. "I have to go," he said, glancing toward the window where the first pale hints of dawn were beginning to creep through the curtains. "But I'll leave you something to remember this conversation by." He tapped the pipe against the edge of the table, and I watched in fascination as ash fell in a perfect spiral, maintaining its shape even as it hit the surface. The ash glowed faintly, holding the exact form of burning tobacco, though no heat emanated from it. Don't make decisions based on fear, Tommy. Your parents did that, and look where it got them. 30 years in jobs they hated, living for weekends and vacations, counting down the days until retirement would finally set them free. The truth of his words hit like a punch to the stomach. My parents had spent my entire childhood complaining about their work, dreaming aloud about what they'd do someday, when they had enough money saved, when the timing was right, when the risk seemed manageable. Someday had never come. The room began to lighten gradually, and I noticed that Grandpa Joe's form was becoming less distinct, as if he were fading along with the darkness. The pipe smoke dissipated, taking with it that overwhelming sweetness, until only the faintest trace remained, just enough to assure me that what I'd experienced hadn't been entirely a dream. "The ash will be gone by full sunrise," he said, his voice now barely audible. "But if you look closely, you'll see it held its shape long enough to leave an impression." I blinked, and he was gone. I stood alone in the kitchen, surrounded by the mundane reality of morning light filtering through faded curtains. The crossword puzzle remained on the table, exactly as Grandpa Joe had left it 2 years ago. No pencil marks disturbed its blank squares. No chair appeared to have been recently occupied. But there, on the table's surface, was a perfect circle of fine ash. It held its shape with impossible precision, each grain positioned as if it had been carefully arranged rather than simply falling from a pipe. As I watched, mesmerized, the first direct ray of sunlight struck the table and the ash began to dissolve, dispersing into nothingness with supernatural speed. Yet beneath where it had rested, burned into the wood itself, was a faint but unmistakable impression, a circular mark that hadn't been there the night before. I reached into my jacket pocket and withdrew the Morrison & Associates contract, my hands trembling as I unfolded the crisp pages. All I had to do was sign on the designated line and my future would be secured. Corner office, company car, enough money to finally live the comfortable life I'd been trained to want. Instead, I found myself reaching for my phone. The newspaper listing was still there when I pulled it up, still advertising for a features writer position in some small town I'd never heard of. The salary was listed as competitive for market, which I knew was code for barely livable. The job description mentioned covering local government meetings, high school sports, and human interest stories, exactly the kind of small-town journalism my professors had taught me to view as career purgatory. My finger hovered over the Apply Now button. Outside, the rain had stopped, and birds were beginning their morning songs. The farmhouse felt less oppressive in the growing light, more like the comforting refuge I remembered from childhood visits. But the smell of pipe tobacco lingered faintly in the air, and the circular burn mark on the table seemed to pulse with significance I couldn't quite grasp. Had any of it really happened? The practical part of my mind insisted it had been nothing more than an anxiety dream, my subconscious mind working through fears about the job offer by conjuring my grandfather's disapproving spirit. Stress could cause hallucinations, couldn't it? Especially in a place so loaded with memories and emotional significance. But the mark on the table was real. I could feel its raised edges beneath my fingertips, could see how the wood had been darkened in a perfect circle. That kind of burn mark took sustained heat to create, the sort that came from a pipe being repeatedly tapped in the same spot over years of use. I thought about my grandfather's words regarding traitors and true callings. I thought about my parents' decades of quiet desperation, their dreams deferred until they became regrets. I thought about the stories I'd once written at this very table, back when words had felt like magic instead of marketing tools. The Morrison and Associates contract felt heavy in my hands. All those years of education and ambition had led to this moment, this choice between security and something that felt dangerously close to hope. I folded the contract and placed it back in my pocket. Then I submitted my application for the features writer position, my heart racing as I hit the send button before I could change my mind. The response came faster than I'd expected. An email from the editor asking if I could interview by phone that afternoon. As I typed my acceptance, I caught another whiff of that sweet pipe tobacco, so faint I might have imagined it. But when I glanced back at the table, the burn mark seemed a shade darker than it had been moments before, as if approving of my choice. I spent the rest of the morning walking the familiar paths of my grandfather's property, breathing deeply of air that tasted of rain and possibility. The interview went well, better than well. The editor seemed genuinely excited about my background and ideas, spoke passionately about the paper's role in its community, described opportunities to cover stories that mattered to real people. By evening, they'd offered me the position. I accepted without hesitation, then called Morrison and Associates to withdraw my candidacy. The headhunter sounded genuinely baffled by my decision, kept asking if there was something they could do to change my mind, some additional compensation or benefit that might sway me. There wasn't. For the first time in years, I felt like I was moving towards something I actually wanted, rather than away from something I feared. As I prepared to leave the farmhouse, I took one last look at the kitchen table. The burn mark remained, a permanent reminder of a night that might have been real or might have been the most vivid dream of my life. In the end, perhaps it didn't matter which. What mattered was the choice I'd made, not based on fear of failure or hunger for security, but on something deeper and harder to define. The same instinct that had once guided me to see faces in wallpaper patterns and write stories late into the night. I locked the farmhouse behind me and started the drive back to the city, windows down to let in the sweet evening air. In 2 weeks, I'd be loading my belongings into a truck and heading to a small town where I'd cover city council meetings and high school football games and people doing ordinary things that somehow added up to lives worth documenting. It wasn't the future I'd planned, but it felt like the future I was meant to have. And if sometimes in quiet moments I caught a whiff of vanilla and cherry pipe tobacco, I chose to take it as confirmation that some choices resonate beyond the boundaries of logic and practicality. That sometimes the voices we hear in the darkness are worth listening to, even when we can't be certain they're real. The ash may have blown away with the morning wind, but its impression remained, burned permanently into the grain of the wood. Like memory, like consequence, like the choices that mark us long after we've made them, whether we're fully awake or caught somewhere between dreams and daylight, deciding which version of ourselves we're brave enough to become. Story 5. The Whitmore Colonial Inn squatted against the October sky like a rotting tooth, its weathered clapboard siding the color of old bone. When Marcus suggested this place for our college reunion, I should have known something was wrong. Marcus always had a taste for the macabre, collecting vintage funeral programs, visiting abandoned asylums, that sort of thing. But the inn was cheap, isolated, and large enough for all 7 of us, so I swallowed my unease and went along with it. The building dated back to 1847, according to the brass plaque by the front door. 2.5 stories of New England colonial architecture, complete with a widow's walk that surveyed the surrounding pine forest like a vulture's perch. The proprietor, a gaunt woman named Mrs. Carmichael, had handed us our keys with trembling fingers and disappeared into what I assumed were her private quarters. We hadn't seen her since. That first evening unfolded predictably enough. 7 middle-aged men trying to recapture something that had probably never existed in the first place. We drank too much beer, told exaggerated stories about our college days, and pretended not to notice how the years had carved lines into our faces and thickened our waistlines. By midnight, most of us had retreated to our rooms, nursing headaches and the peculiar melancholy that comes with confronting the gulf between who we were and who we'd become. I lay in room 7, listening to the building settle around me. Old houses make noise. Everyone knows that. The foundation shifts, the wood contracts, pipes tick and gurgle in the walls. But this was different. These sounds had a rhythm to them, almost like breathing. Like the house itself was alive, drawing air into its wooden lungs and releasing it through gaps in the floorboards. At 2:17 a.m., the scream tore through the inn like a blade through silk. It wasn't human, couldn't have been human, yet it spoke my name with crystalline clarity. Daniel. Not shouted, not whispered, but proclaimed with the authority of something that had always known exactly who I was. The sound seemed to originate from everywhere and nowhere, vibrating through the floorboards, the walls, even the air itself. I shot upright, heart hammering against my ribs. The scream, or was it a song, lasted exactly 3 seconds before cutting off with surgical precision, then silence. Not the natural quiet of a sleeping building, but the oppressive hush that follows a car accident or a sudden death. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. Doors creaked open. Tentative voices called out, asking if everyone was okay, if anyone else had heard that sound. I pulled on my clothes and joined the others in the main corridor, where we stood in our pajamas and underwear like confused children awakened from a shared nightmare. Marcus insisted he'd heard his own name called. So did Jeff and Robert and the others. Each swore with absolute certainty that the voice had spoken directly to him, and only to him. When I mentioned hearing Daniel, they looked at me with the kind of polite skepticism reserved for the delusional. We searched the inn from basement to attic, finding nothing. No broken windows, no signs of intruders, no logical explanation for what we'd experienced. Eventually, we returned to our rooms, but sleep proved elusive. I lay staring at the water-stained ceiling, replaying that impossible sound in my mind. The voice hadn't been male or female, young or old. It existed outside such mundane categories, carrying an authority that made my bones vibrate like tuning forks. The next morning, Robert discovered the security system. Mrs. Carmichael had mentioned it in passing during check-in, a basic setup with cameras in the common areas and motion sensors throughout the building. Robert worked in IT and had a knack for technology. He accessed the recordings from the previous night and called us all to witness his findings. 7 audio files, all time-stamped at exactly 2:17:13 a.m. 7 different locations throughout the inn, forming what appeared to be a perfect circle when plotted on the building's floor plan. Each recording captured a voice calling a different name, though the voice itself was identical. That same impossible, genderless tone that seemed to resonate from somewhere beyond the physical world. We played them back in sequence. Marcus, Jeffrey, Robert, David, Thomas, Christopher, Daniel. 7 names, 7 voices, 7 identical impossibilities recorded simultaneously in locations that were acoustically isolated from one another. I suggested we leave. The others laughed it off as an elaborate prank, though their laughter had a brittle quality that suggested they were trying to convince themselves as much as me. Someone must have rigged the system, they reasoned. A former guest with technical skills and a twisted sense of humor. There had to be a rational explanation. But I remembered the weight of that voice when it spoke my name. The way it seemed to bypass my ears entirely and resonate directly in the cavity of my skull. That wasn't technology. That was something else entirely. The second night brought another calling at precisely 2:17 a.m. This time, the voice spoke names I didn't recognize. Eleanor, Margaret, William, Samuel. 4 names, 4 audio files, 4 new points on our expanding circle. Robert pulled up genealogy websites and made phone calls to family members, slowly piecing together the connections. These were our relatives, grandparents, great-aunts, and uncles, the dead branches of our family trees. By the third night, I was barely sleeping. I lay in bed counting the minutes until 2:17, my body rigid with anticipation. When the voice came, it called out another cluster of unfamiliar names. More relatives, Robert confirmed the next morning, more branches being added to our collective family tree. The pattern became clear over the following nights. Each calling added names to our genealogy, working backward through generations, filling in the gaps with methodical precision. Great-great-grandparents, distant cousins, children who had died in infancy. The voice knew them all, spoke each name with the same eerie clarity, as if reading from some cosmic registry of the dead. I started to notice other things, the way shadows seemed to linger longer than they should in the corners of rooms, the sensation of being watched whenever I turned my back, glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision that vanished the instant I tried to focus on them. The others dismissed these observations as stress and sleep deprivation, but I could see the same wariness creeping into their own expressions. On the seventh night, I made a discovery that sent ice water through my veins. Unable to sleep, I had wandered down to the main floor and found myself drawn to the inn's small library. Dusty volumes filled floor-to-ceiling shelves, most dating back decades or even centuries. I pulled down a leather-bound registry, curious about the inn's history, and began flipping through pages of guest signatures and dates. The Whitmore family name appeared repeatedly throughout the book's early pages. Different first names, but always that surname, spanning generations of entries from the inn's founding in 1847 through the early 1900s. Then, abruptly, the Whitmore entries stopped. I found the explanation in a yellowed newspaper clipping tucked between the registry's pages. November 3rd, 1903. A family gathering had turned tragic when 7 members of the Whitmore clan had vanished from the inn overnight. No signs of violence, no indication of where they had gone. They simply disappeared, leaving behind their belongings and a building that stood empty for decades afterward. The photograph accompanying the article showed 7 figures posed on the inn's front porch. Though the image was grainy and darkened with age, I could make out their faces clearly enough. 7 adults, all bearing an unmistakable resemblance to the 7 men currently occupying the inn. I stared at that photograph until my eyes watered, tracing the familiar jawlines and nose shapes, the genetic echoes that had carried forward through more than a century. We weren't just random college friends who had chosen this place for a reunion, we were descendants. The voice wasn't calling out arbitrary names, it was completing a family tree that had been severed over 100 years ago. The next morning I tried to share my discovery with the others. They gathered around the registry with expressions of polite interest that quickly transformed into something else entirely. Because the page I turned to, the page where I had found the Whitmore entries, was blank. Not torn out, not damaged, but completely empty, as if nothing had ever been written there at all. The newspaper clipping was gone as well. When I searched through every page of the registry, I found no trace of the Whitmore family or the article about their disappearance. The others looked at me with the careful sympathy reserved for someone having a breakdown. That night, I packed my bag and sat by the window, waiting for 2:17 a.m. to arrive. I had no intention of sleeping, no desire to hear what names the voice might call next. I would listen, document everything, and leave immediately afterward. Whatever was happening here, I wanted no part of it. The voice came as it always did, punctual as death itself. But this time was different. Instead of the usual cluster of names, it spoke only one word, drawn out like a song that lasted exactly 3 seconds. Whitmore. Not my name. Not Daniel. Whitmore, the family name that connected all of us. The surname that had been erased from the registry but continued to flow through our bloodlines like a hidden current. I understood then why my name had never been called individually. I wasn't just another descendant attending this reunion. I was the key, the final piece needed to complete whatever ritual or summons was taking place. The voice had been calling our ancestors home, one generation at a time, but it couldn't finish without acknowledging the family name itself. As that impossible sound faded into silence, I heard movement in the hallway, Not the quick, panicked footsteps of previous nights, but slow, deliberate walking. The others were emerging from their rooms, but they moved with a synchronized precision that sent terror crawling up my spine like a living thing. I pressed myself against the window, watching their shadows pass beneath my door. They walked in perfect unison, their footsteps creating a rhythm that matched the house's breathing. Down the stairs they went, moving towards some destination I couldn't see but could feel in the marrow of my bones. I should have run then, should have crashed through the window, fled into the forest, driven away without looking back. Instead, I found myself opening my door and following them, drawn by a compulsion that felt older than my own will. The main floor was empty, but I could hear them moving somewhere below. A basement I hadn't known existed, accessible through a door that definitely hadn't been there during our earlier searches. I descended wooden steps that creaked under my weight, following the sound of synchronized breathing into a space that shouldn't have been possible given the inn's foundation. 7 figures stood in a perfect circle, their backs to me, facing inward towards something I couldn't see. They swayed slightly, as if moved by a breeze that existed only in this underground chamber. When I tried to call out to them, no sound emerged from my throat. The air itself seemed thick here, charged with an energy that made my skin crawl and my teeth ache. Shadows moved independently of their sources, writhing across the walls like living things. And in the center of that circle, where my friends, or the things that had been my friends, focused their attention, something was taking shape. I can't describe what I saw there. Language fails when confronted with impossibilities, and my mind refuses to form complete memories of those moments. I remember fragments. The sensation of being unmade and remade, of time folding back on itself, of names and identities shifting like sand in a cosmic wind. When I next became aware of my surroundings, I was standing alone in the main hallway. Dawn light filtered through the windows, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. The inn felt different now, not empty, but expectant, as if holding its breath. I found my bag where I had left it and walked outside to my car. The others' vehicles remained in the parking area, keys dangling from ignitions, doors unlocked. I considered taking the keys with me, preventing whatever was happening from spreading beyond this place. But some instinct warned me against interfering further. As I drove away, I glanced back at the inn in my rearview mirror. 7 figures stood on the front porch, watching my departure. From that distance, they looked exactly like the men I had known: Marcus, Jeff, Robert, and the others. But something in their posture and the way they held themselves suggested otherwise. I never reported their disappearance. Who would believe such a story? Instead, I moved across the country, changed my name, tried to forget. But the voice follows me still, whispering in moments between sleep and waking. It knows where I am. It knows what I am, because I understand now what I couldn't grasp that night in the basement. The calling wasn't finished. It had gathered 6 of the 7, completed most of the family tree, but one crucial element remained. Every night at 2:17 a.m., I hear my new name spoken with that same impossible clarity. Not Daniel. That identity belonged to someone else, someone who attended a college reunion and never came home. The voice calls me by my true name now, the name I was always meant to answer to: Whitmore. And someday soon, I'm going to have to answer that call. Story 6. The first time I heard the wind speak, I was replacing a fuel line on a Cessna 182 when the afternoon heat began its familiar dance across the tarmac. What started as a whisper became a roar that carried the acrid perfume of burned kerosene and the metallic scream of stressed aluminum. Most mechanics would have dismissed it as another thermal updraft typical of our high-altitude plateau, but I've worked these runways for 15 years. I know the difference between normal wind and something that shouldn't exist. The pilot radioed engine trouble 23 minutes later. That was 3 weeks ago, and since then, the pattern has become as predictable as it is impossible. The phenomenon arrives precisely when the mercury climbs past 95 degrees, always from the southeast quadrant, always carrying that same cocktail of aviation fuel and tortured metal. I've started keeping detailed logs, temperature readings, wind speed, humidity levels, even the exact pitch of the sound it makes as it sweeps across the runway. The data tells a story that makes my hands shake when I review it in the quiet of my workshop after hours. Every incident follows the same timeline. The warning wind arrives, carrying its impossible cargo of smells and sounds, and within 30 minutes, an aircraft reports mechanical failure. Not catastrophic failure, never that, but significant enough to ground the plane and send pilots muttering about mixture problems and electrical gremlins they can't explain. The mechanics find nothing wrong. The engines run perfectly on the test stands, but the pilots know. They've felt something out there, something that whispers warnings through the propeller wash and sets their instruments dancing lies. I tried explaining it to Jake Morrison, our head mechanic, but his weathered face just creased into that familiar expression of barely concealed concern he reserves for people who might be cracking under pressure. Jake's seen too many good mechanics lose their edge to altitude and isolation, and I could read in his eyes the careful calculation of whether I needed a mandatory psych evaluation or just a long weekend in Denver. The archives in the airport's administrative building yielded the truth I'd been dreading. 31 years ago this month, 3 aircraft from the local flying club had taken off on a routine training exercise. The weather was perfect, visibility unlimited, winds calm. They never made it past the traffic pattern. One by one, each pilot reported engine problems and attempted emergency landings. The first 2 made it down safely, shaken but unharmed. The third wasn't as fortunate, not fatal, thank God, but career-ending injuries that grounded him permanently. What the official report didn't mention, but what I found in the handwritten notes of the investigator, was the testimony of ground crew who reported unusual wind conditions immediately preceding each emergency. Strong thermal currents carrying the smell of burned fuel and the sound of metal under stress. Conditions that made no meteorological sense and left no trace in the official weather recordings. The investigator had dismissed these accounts as post-incident confusion, the kind of false memories that emerge when people try to find patterns in random events. But I recognized every detail. The southeast origin, the precise temperature threshold, the unmistakable sensory signature of something that shouldn't be possible. I started positioning myself near the active runway whenever conditions aligned with my growing database of atmospheric anomalies. The other mechanics began to notice my obsessive monitoring of weather instruments and my habit of abandoning whatever work I was doing to rush outside when the temperature spiked. Their sideways glances carried the weight of unspoken concern, but I couldn't explain without sounding like exactly the kind of unstable employee who gets quietly reassigned to desk duty. Yesterday, the wind came early. I was calibrating instruments in the avionics bay when the familiar pressure change tickled the edge of my consciousness. The barometer hadn't moved, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere around us. I dropped my multimeter and sprinted outside, knowing I had perhaps 15 minutes before the first aircraft would encounter whatever was building out there on the boundary between normal and impossible. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as I positioned myself near the threshold of runway 27, the same strip where the incidents had occurred 3 decades ago. The air shimmered with heat distortion, but underneath the normal thermal activity, something else was stirring. The hair on my forearms stood at attention despite the sweltering temperature, and the distinctive metallic taste of ozone coated my tongue. Then it hit. The wind arrived like a freight train carrying the contents of a burning hangar. The smell of overheated aviation fuel mixed with hot metal and something else. Something organic and wrong that made my stomach clench with primal revulsion. But worse than the olfactory assault was the sound. A low harmonic moan that seemed to emerge from the runway itself, building to a crescendo that felt less like wind and more like the death song of aircraft not yet born. I fumbled for my radio, knowing that Tower would never believe what I was about to report, but compelled by a certainty that someone was about to die if I remained silent. As I keyed the microphone, movement caught my peripheral vision. A small training aircraft was turning final approach, perfectly aligned with the runway, completely unaware of the atmospheric nightmare waiting to embrace it. The pilot's voice crackled through the radio frequency, routine and professional as he called his position, but I could hear something underneath his standard phraseology. a tension that suggested his instruments were already beginning their false chorus of warnings and alarms. The wind howled louder, and I swear I could distinguish individual voices within its chaotic symphony, speaking in languages I didn't recognize but somehow understood. They were warnings. I screamed into my radio for the pilot to abort, to go around, to climb and flee this pocket of impossible atmosphere that had claimed others before him. The tower controller's sharp response demanded clarification, but I had no rational explanation for the urgency that clawed at my chest like a living thing. How could I explain that the wind itself had become malevolent, that the very air was trying to communicate the approach of disaster through sensory channels that shouldn't exist? The aircraft touched down safely. The pilot taxied to the ramp without incident, shut down his engine, and climbed out to begin his post-flight inspection. Everything appeared normal. The wind had died to its usual late-afternoon whisper, carrying nothing more sinister than the smell of hot asphalt and distant sagebrush. My instruments registered standard atmospheric conditions. The temperature had dropped below the critical threshold, and the world had returned to its ordinary, explicable state. But I saw the pilot's hands trembling as he checked his fuel caps. I noticed how he lingered over his engine compartment, searching for some explanation for the warnings his instruments had screamed during those final moments of approach. Most telling of all, I watched him pull out his logbook and stare at the blank space where he would normally record another routine flight. He wrote nothing. Tonight, I sit in my workshop surrounded by 3 weeks of meticulous data, trying to convince myself that correlation doesn't equal causation, that pattern recognition can become pathological when pushed beyond the boundaries of reason. The wind that speaks might be nothing more than the intersection of thermal dynamics and psychological stress, a perfect storm of atmospheric conditions and occupational paranoia that creates the illusion of supernatural intervention. But tomorrow afternoon, when the temperature climbs toward that critical threshold and the southeast wind begins to stir, I'll be waiting beside runway 27 with my radio in hand. Because whether the wind's warnings emerge from some impossible fold in reality or from the deepest recesses of my deteriorating sanity, the pattern remains unbroken. And patterns in aviation are everything. The aircraft are still coming. The wind is still speaking. And somewhere between the measurable and the impossible, between the rational and the terrifying, the truth waits like a frequency just beyond the range of normal reception, clear enough to recognize, too distorted to fully understand. I've become the listener, the translator, the guardian standing between routine flights and the whispered prophecies of atmospheric ghosts. Whether I'm saving lives or slowly losing my mind matters less than the certainty that burns in my chest when that wind begins to blow. Someone has to hear the warnings. Someone has to be ready. Story 7. The mirror first lied to us on a Tuesday. I remember because Marcus had been complaining about his accounting class all evening, the same way he'd been complaining every Tuesday for the past month. We'd settled into our usual spots on the sectional sofa, him sprawled across the left side, me tucked into the corner where the armrest met the back cushions. The television droned some mindless sitcom, its blue-white glow washing over our cramped living room in waves that synchronized with the laugh track. That's when I saw it in the mirror. The full-length mirror stood against the wall behind us, positioned so we could see ourselves reflected whenever we turned around. Lisa, my ex, had insisted we needed it to make the room look bigger. Marcus and I had never bothered moving it after she left, partly out of laziness, partly because it did make the space feel less claustrophobic. The mirror had become furniture, background, invisible in the way that familiar objects disappear into the landscape of daily life, until it showed us something that shouldn't have been there. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The silhouette stood directly behind our couch, tall and impossibly thin, stretched like taffy toward the ceiling. Its head, if it had one, disappeared into the shadows where the overhead light couldn't reach. No face that I could discern, just a smooth expanse where features should have been. The figure didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't seem to acknowledge its own existence. It simply stood there, watching us from within the silver surface. I turned around so fast my neck cracked. Nothing. Just the wall, the switch plate, the small table where we kept our keys and loose change. The space directly behind the couch held only air and the faint smell of Marcus's cologne mixed with the Chinese takeout we'd had for dinner. When I looked back at the mirror, the figure was gone. Our reflection showed exactly what should have been there. Two guys on a couch, one of them staring intensely at a mirror like he'd lost his mind. Marcus asked me what was wrong and I told him nothing. Just thought I'd seen something. He didn't look up from his phone, just made some non-committal noise that might have been agreement or dismissal. The television continued its relentless cycle of setup and punchline, while I stared at our reflection and tried to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. But the next night, it was back. This time I was ready. I'd been watching the mirror peripherally all evening, checking it whenever Marcus wasn't looking, waiting. The figure appeared around 9:30, materializing behind us like smoke condensing into form. Same impossible height, same absence of features, same perfect stillness. I counted to 10 before turning around, sure that this time I'd catch something. Some evidence that my eyes weren't playing tricks. The wall remained stubbornly empty. Yet when I looked back at the mirror, there it stood. Not quite in the same position as before. Maybe a foot closer to the left side of the couch, still well behind us but somehow more present, as if it had gained substance overnight. I started keeping track. Wednesday. The figure appeared at 9:27 p.m., 2 feet closer to Marcus's side of the couch. Thursday, 9:24 p.m., close enough that if it had been real, its legs would have been touching the sofa's back cushions. Friday. Marcus went out with some coworkers, and I spent the evening alone, staring at the mirror. The figure never appeared. The reflection showed only me, sitting rigid on the couch, my own face drawn and pale in the silver surface. I looked like someone waiting for bad news. Saturday. The figure was back, appearing at 9:23 p.m. It stood directly behind my section of the couch now, close enough that I could see its reflection from the waist down. Its legs were wrong, too long, jointed in places that didn't make anatomical sense. The fabric of its clothing, if it was clothing, moved differently than it should have, flowing upward rather than hanging down, defying gravity in a way that made my stomach clench. I began to notice other details. The way shadows fell differently in the mirror, creating pockets of darkness that didn't correspond to any light source in the actual room. How the reflection of the television screen sometimes showed different images than what we were actually watching. Faces I didn't recognize, speaking words I couldn't hear. The temperature seemed to drop whenever the figure appeared, though Marcus never mentioned feeling cold. Sunday brought the first time I saw its movement. The figure didn't walk so much as flow, its elongated form shifting position without apparent effort. One moment it stood behind Marcus, the next behind me, then in the center, equidistant from both of us. The transitions were seamless, like frames cut from a film reel. I found myself blinking rapidly, trying to catch the movement between positions, but it was always just there, static again by the time my eyes focused. Marcus started asking if I was feeling all right. I'd been jumping at shadows, checking the mirror obsessively, turning around so often that I'd given myself a crick in the neck. I told him I'd been having trouble sleeping, which wasn't entirely a lie. Every night after the figure disappeared, always sometime after 10, always without warning, I'd lie in bed replaying what I'd seen, analyzing every detail, searching for some rational explanation that continued to elude me. By the second week, the figure had begun moving forward, not toward the couch, but toward the surface of the mirror itself. Each night it stood a little closer to the glass, as if approaching from a great distance within the reflection. The effect was subtle at first, maybe an inch or two difference in perspective, but became more pronounced as the days passed. I started measuring its progress using the furniture as reference points. Monday, level with the coffee table. Tuesday, halfway between the coffee table and the television stand. Wednesday, close enough to the mirror's surface that I could make out the texture of its form. which resembled fabric but moved like liquid. The air in the apartment grew thick, oppressive. I found myself breathing carefully, as if taking too deep a breath might disturb something fragile and dangerous. The smell of the place changed too. Not unpleasant exactly, but different. Like ozone before a storm, or the metallic taste you get before a nosebleed. Marcus didn't seem to notice, but then again, Marcus had always been oblivious to subtlety. I considered telling him. Several times I opened my mouth to explain what I'd been seeing, but the words felt ridiculous before I could speak them. How do you tell your roommate that the mirror is showing you something impossible? How do you describe a figure that exists only in reflection, that moves without walking, that gets closer every night to something you can't define? Instead, I started avoiding the living room in the evenings. I'd make excuses to stay in my bedroom, claiming I had work to catch up on or calls to make. But the compulsion to check the mirror was stronger than my fear. Every night around 9:15, I'd find myself back on the couch, watching and waiting, documenting the figure's inexorable approach. Thursday of the second week brought the first time I saw its face. Not clearly, the figure still lacked conventional features, but as it pressed closer to the mirror's surface, I could make out subtle variations in the smooth expanse where a face should have been. Indentations that might have been eye sockets, a slightly raised area that could have been a nose, a horizontal line that suggested a mouth. The longer I stared, the more definite these features became, as if my observation was willing them into existence. The mouth, if it was a mouth, moved. I couldn't hear any sound. The mirror had never carried audio, only visual distortions, but I could see the subtle motion of speech. The figure was trying to tell me something, its reflection mouth forming words I couldn't decipher. I leaned forward, straining to read its lips, when Marcus shifted beside me and asked what I was looking at so intently. I glanced at him, then back at the mirror. The figure was gone, our reflection normal again. But for just a moment before it vanished, I could have sworn I saw its mouth form a single, clear word. Soon. That night I couldn't sleep. I paced my bedroom, checked the locks on the front door twice, peered out the windows at the empty street below. Everything looked normal, exactly as it should have, but the feeling of being watched had followed me from the living room. Even with my bedroom door closed and locked, I felt exposed, observed by something I couldn't see. The next morning I researched mirrors and supernatural phenomena, diving deep into forums and websites dedicated to paranormal experiences. I found stories of people seeing things in mirrors that weren't there, of reflections that moved independently, of figures that appeared only in glass surfaces. Some claimed these were glimpses into other dimensions. Others believed them to be manifestations of mental illness. The clinical term was spectral hallucination, seeing things that weren't there, often in reflective surfaces. I took comfort in the medical explanation until I realized it didn't account for the figure's consistent behavior, its nightly appearances at predictable times, its steady progression toward the mirror's surface. Hallucinations were supposed to be random, chaotic. This was systematic, purposeful. Friday night. The figure stood so close to the mirror that its form pressed against the glass from the inside. I could see the surface of the mirror bow slightly inward wherever the figure touched it, creating subtle distortions in our reflection. My own face looked warped, my features stretched and unfamiliar. Marcus appeared normal, unchanged, as if the mirror's distortion affected only me. The figure raised one of its impossibly long arms. Its hand, I could see now that it had hands, though they were wrong, too many fingers or not enough, pressed flat against the mirror's surface. The glass bowed further inward, and I heard a sound like settling wood, a creak of pressure applied to something not meant to bear weight. The figure's face, such as it was, turned toward me specifically, ignoring Marcus entirely. Its mouth moved again, and this time I was certain of the word, tomorrow. Saturday came with a heaviness that settled into my bones. I moved through the day in a haze, distracted and jumpy, starting at every unexpected sound. Marcus suggested I see a doctor, mentioned that I'd been acting strange for weeks. I nodded and promised I would, but knew I had to get through one more night first. Whatever was going to happen, it would happen tonight. I considered leaving, checking into a hotel, or staying with friends until whatever this was resolved itself. But I understood instinctively that running wouldn't help. The figure hadn't appeared in any other mirrors. I'd checked every reflective surface in the apartment, only in the living room mirror, only when I was there to see it. This was personal, targeted, meant specifically for me. Evening crawled toward night with agonizing slowness. Marcus and I ate dinner in relative silence, the television providing background noise that felt more oppressive than comforting. I kept checking my watch. 8:47, 8:52, 9:03. My heart hammered against my ribs as 9:15 approached. At 9:17, the figure appeared, but not behind us, not at a distance within the mirror's depth. It stood directly against the glass, its entire form pressed against the surface from the inside. The mirror bowed inward under the pressure, and I could hear it now. Not just the creaking of stressed glass, but a sound like wind through a tunnel, like breathing that came from everywhere and nowhere. The figure raised both arms, placing its hands against the mirror with palms flat. Where it touched, the glass didn't just bow. It began to stretch, thinning like plastic heated over flame. I could see through the distorted areas to what lay beyond. Not the wall behind the mirror, but something else entirely. A space that extended infinitely in all directions, filled with shifting shadows and half-formed shapes that might have been more figures, all watching, all waiting. The figure's face pressed against the thinning glass. Its features were clearer now, more defined, and I realized with a shock of recognition that it looked like me. Not exactly. The proportions were wrong, the features stretched and distorted, but unmistakably my face, as if someone had tried to recreate my reflection from memory and gotten the details slightly wrong. Its mouth moved, and this time I heard the words, whispered directly into my mind, "Your turn." The glass stretched thinner, like a soap bubble about to burst. The figure's hand pushed through, breaking the surface tension, reaching into our reality. Cold air rushed through the opening, carrying scents of metal and ozone, and something organic that I didn't want to identify. I wanted to run, to scream, to grab Marcus and get us both out of the apartment. But I found myself frozen, watching as the figure's impossibly long arm reached toward me, fingers extended, aiming for my shoulder just as I'd always known it would. The touch, when it came, was gentle, almost tender, like a friend placing a reassuring hand on my shoulder, except that the fingers were too long and too cold, and seemed to reach not just through my shirt, but through my skin, touching something deeper, something essential. The world inverted. I was looking at myself from inside the mirror, watching my own face stare back with an expression of absolute terror. Marcus sat beside my body, still focused on his phone, oblivious to the fact that I was no longer there, that something else was looking out through my eyes. The thing wearing my face turned to look at him, and I saw it smile with my mouth, an expression I'd never made, would never make. I pressed my hands against the glass from this side, feeling it bow outward now, trying to push through back to the real world. But the surface remained solid, unyielding. I was the reflection now, the shadow, the thing that existed only in silver surfaces. Behind me in this mirror world, I could sense others. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, all pressed against their own barriers, all trying to return to the lives that had been stolen from them. Some had been here so long they'd forgotten their own names, their own faces, become the stretched and distorted figures I'd glimpsed in the deeper shadows. The thing wearing my body stood up from the couch, my legs moving with jerky, unfamiliar motions. It was learning how to be me, how to inhabit my life. Marcus finally looked up, asked if I was feeling better, commented that I looked different somehow. The thing nodded with my head and said yes, much better, thank you for asking. From inside the mirror, I watched it live my life. I watched it perfect my mannerisms, my speech patterns, my relationships. I watched it become a better version of me, more confident, more social, more successful. Marcus never suspected. My coworkers never noticed. My family, when they called, found nothing strange in my voice. The worst part wasn't the imprisonment. It wasn't even watching my life continue without me. The worst part was that I began to understand why it had happened. Late at night, when the apartment was quiet and the thing wearing my body had gone to sleep in my bed, I could see clearly for the first time. In the reflection, without the distraction of my physical form, I could perceive things that had been invisible before. The way Marcus sometimes stood too close when he talked to me. The way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his breathing changed when I was near. I could see the other mirrors in the apartment too. All of them connected. All of them showing different angles of the same truth. In the bathroom mirror, I saw Marcus standing behind me while I brushed my teeth, his hands hovering just inches from my neck. In the bedroom mirror, I saw him going through my things while I was at work, touching my clothes, my personal items, with an intimacy that made my skin crawl. And in the medicine cabinet mirror, I saw the small vial of clear liquid he'd been adding to my drinks for weeks. The reason I'd been feeling strange, disoriented, paranoid. The reason I'd started seeing things that weren't there, except they had been there. The figure in the mirror had been real but not supernatural. It had been Marcus somehow, his obsession made manifest, his desire to possess me literally given form through means I couldn't understand and didn't want to. Now I watched from behind the glass as the thing wearing my face learned to love him back, to accept his touches, to smile when he brought me drinks I no longer needed to fear. I watched my body respond to his affection with an enthusiasm I'd never felt, saw myself become the person he'd always wanted me to be. The realization brought with it a terrible clarity. I hadn't been the victim of some supernatural force. I'd been the victim of something far more ordinary, far more human, and infinitely more horrifying. But as days passed and the thing wearing my life grew more comfortable in my skin, I began to wonder if the distinction mattered. Whether the hand on my shoulder belonged to a mirror demon or a deranged roommate, the result was the same. I was gone, and someone else was living my life better than I ever had. Sometimes I catch glimpses of other mirrors, other apartments, other people pressing their faces against the glass with expressions of dawning horror. The network is vast, the reflections infinite. We're all here together, all the displaced ones, all the replaced ones, watching our lives continue without us. And sometimes, late at night when the apartment is quiet, I see him, Marcus. Not the thing wearing my body, but the real Marcus, pressed against a mirror somewhere else, his face stretched and distorted, his mouth forming words I can't hear. He's trying to tell me something, trying to warn me, but it's too late for warnings. I understand now that it was never about the supernatural. It was about desire taken to its logical extreme, about love that refused to accept rejection, about obsession that found a way to make itself real. The thing wearing my face is kind to Marcus, grateful for his attention, responsive to his needs. It's everything he wanted me to be, and everything I never was. And sometimes, when I see how happy they are together, I wonder if this isn't better for everyone. After all, what's the difference between being alive and being a reflection of life? What's the difference between genuine feeling and a perfect imitation of feeling? I press my hands against the glass and feel it give slightly, just enough to offer hope, just enough to keep me trying. Around me, the other reflections do the same, all of us pushing against our barriers, all of us trying to return to lives that may no longer belong to us. The mirror shows only what it chooses to show, and sometimes I think it's showing me exactly what I need to see, but I can never be sure. Story 8. The first time I heard them, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks after another 14-hour shift at the office. The subway walkway stretched ahead like a concrete throat, fluorescent lights flickering in that stuttering rhythm that makes everything feel like a broken film reel. My footsteps echoed off the tiled walls, sharp, precise clicks of leather against stone. But underneath, threaded through my own sounds like a shadow made audible, came the others. Click, pause, click. Click, pause, click. 3 meters behind. Always 3 meters. I stopped mid-stride, my hand instinctively reaching for my phone. The silence that followed felt thick, pregnant with possibility. I turned around, squinting down the tunnel's length. Nothing but empty space and the distant hum of ventilation systems. The overhead lights cast everything in that sickly yellow that makes skin look corpse pale, and shadows seemed deeper than they should be. When I started walking again, they resumed. Not immediately. There was always that split-second delay, as if whatever made those sounds needed a moment to remember how to move. But they came back, matching my pace with unsettling precision. I experimented, slowing down until I was barely shuffling forward. The echo slowed too. I picked up speed, my own footsteps becoming urgent staccato beats. Behind me, the sounds accelerated, maintaining that exact distance like a leash I couldn't see. By the time I reached the turnstiles, sweat was beading on my forehead despite the October chill that seeped through the station's bones. I fumbled for my Metro card, swiped through, and immediately spun around. The walkway behind me remained empty, but I could swear I felt eyes on me. Not malicious, exactly, but intensely curious, like something studying me through a microscope. The train ride home passed in a blur of rattling steel and compressed bodies. I found myself checking over my shoulder every few minutes, scanning faces for something I couldn't name. Everyone looked normal, tired commuters with their heads buried in phones, a few late-shift workers dozing against windows. But normalcy felt like a mask that night, and I couldn't shake the feeling that if I looked hard enough, I'd see something else peering back. The audio messages started 3 days later. I woke to the soft chime of my phone at 3:03 a.m., groggily reaching for the device on my nightstand. A new voicemail from an unknown number. I pressed play, expecting a wrong number or maybe some drunk dialing incident. 3 seconds of nothing. Not silence. Nothing has texture, weight. This was different. It was as if someone had recorded the space between thoughts, the pause between heartbeats. When it ended, I sat up in bed, suddenly wide awake. The timestamp glowed on my screen. 3:03 a.m. exactly. I told myself it was a glitch, some automated system misfiring in the digital void. But when it happened again the next night, and the night after that, I began keeping my phone on silent. The messages still came through, though. 3:03 a.m. every time. 3 seconds of that peculiar emptiness that seemed to press against my eardrums like reverse sound. By the end of the week, I was timing my commute differently, leaving the office earlier to avoid the empty walkway. But the city's veins run deep, and all paths eventually lead to the same underground arteries. No matter which route I took, which station I used, the footsteps found me. They were becoming clearer, more defined. I could distinguish the slight wet sound of skin against concrete, the whisper of fabric brushing stone. Bare feet, I realized with a chill. Someone was following me through the subway system in bare feet. I started recording on my phone, hoping to capture evidence of what I was hearing. The playback was always the same. My own footsteps, sharp and clear, and underneath them, a rhythmic tapping that sounded like drops of water falling into a deep well. Okoko, okoko, okoko. The sound was hollow, echoing in ways that seemed to defy the tunnel's acoustics. Dr. Reeves leaned back in her chair, fingers steepled as she considered my words. I'd finally broken down and made an appointment, driven by 3 weeks of sleepless nights, and the growing certainty that I was either losing my mind or being stalked by something that had no business existing in the rational world. Auditory hallucinations can be triggered by stress, David, she said, her voice carrying that professional calm that made me want to scream. You've been working long hours, dealing with significant pressure at your job. The mind sometimes creates patterns where none exist, especially in environments like subway tunnels where sound naturally distorts. I pulled out my phone, scrolled to the latest recording. Then explain this. The hollow tapping filled her office, that wet, rhythmic sound that had become the soundtrack to my commute. Dr. Reeves frowned, adjusting her glasses. That could be any number of things. Water dripping, structural settling, even the echo of your own footsteps reflecting off tunnel walls at different intervals. She paused the recording, studied the waveform on my screen. Our brains are pattern-seeking machines, David. Sometimes we find patterns that aren't really there. But I saw something flicker in her expression, a brief tightening around her eyes that suggested she heard it too, that wrongness in the sound that made it more than just environmental noise. I began taking different routes home, mapping the subway system like a general planning a retreat. Local trains instead of express. Different stations, different tunnels. It didn't matter. The footsteps adapted, finding me wherever I went. They were learning my patterns, anticipating my movements. One evening, desperation drove me to try something I knew was probably stupid. I stopped in the middle of the longest walkway I could find, the connection between Times Square and the Port Authority. Rush hour had passed, leaving the tunnel mostly empty except for a few late commuters hurrying toward their trains. I stood there, phone in hand, listening. The footsteps stopped when I stopped. I could feel them there, 3 meters back, waiting. "I know you're there," I said aloud, my voice disappearing into the tunnel's depths. A woman passing by gave me a concerned look and quickened her pace. "What do you want?" Nothing. Just the distant rumble of trains and the whisper of air through ventilation shafts. I turned around slowly, scanning every shadow, every alcove. The tunnel stretched empty in both directions, but the feeling of being watched had intensified. It was like standing under a microscope while invisible hands adjusted the focus. When I started walking again, the footsteps resumed. But this time, they seemed closer. Not 3 meters anymore, maybe 2.5. The distance was shrinking. The audio messages evolved too. Instead of 3 seconds of emptiness, they began to contain something else. A sound so faint I had to strain to hear it. Breathing. Slow, measured inhalations and exhalations that matched my own sleeping rhythm. Someone was recording themselves breathing while I slept, sending me audio proof that they were there, in sync with my most vulnerable moments. I stopped sleeping. Coffee became my primary food group, and my apartment felt less like a sanctuary and more like a stage where I performed the role of normalcy for an audience I couldn't see. I covered the windows, checked the locks obsessively, and still felt exposed. The footsteps were getting closer. 2 meters now, sometimes less. I could hear the scrape of toenails against concrete, the soft slap of flesh hitting stone. During one particularly vivid episode, I swore I could smell something, not unpleasant exactly, but organic and unfamiliar, like rain on hot pavement mixed with something metallic. I consulted building security about my apartment, changed my phone number twice, even filed a police report that I knew sounded insane as soon as the words left my mouth. The officer who took my statement was polite but skeptical, asking questions about my stress levels and suggesting I speak to a counselor. He didn't ask to hear the recordings. 3 weeks after my visit to Dr. Reeves, I discovered something that changed everything. I was reviewing the audio files on my phone, comparing timestamps and waveforms, when I noticed a pattern I'd missed before. The hollow tapping sounds, the okyoko rhythm, weren't random. They were Morse code. My hands shook as I pulled up a translation app, inputting the pattern of short and long beats. The message was simple, repeated over and over in every recording. "Wait for me." I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Wait for what? How long had this message been there, buried in sounds I'd dismissed as environmental noise? That night, the 3:03 a.m. message was different. Instead of breathing, I heard something that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. It was my own voice, but distant and distorted, as if recorded through multiple layers of glass. "I know you're there. What do you want?" My exact words from the Times Square tunnel played back to me with perfect clarity. But I hadn't been recording when I spoke them. Someone else had captured those words, held on to them, and now they were being returned to me like a gift I never wanted to receive. I stopped taking the subway entirely. Buses, taxis, even walking 20 blocks in the rain, anything to avoid those tunnels. But the city's underground network is vast and interconnected, and eventually circumstances forced my hand. A water main break on the east side eliminated most surface transportation options. and I found myself descending into the familiar fluorescent hell of the subway system. The footsteps were waiting for me. But something was different this time. They were closer, maybe 6 feet behind instead of the usual distance, and they weren't trying to match my pace anymore. They had their own rhythm now, their own purpose. I could hear them more clearly than ever, the whisper of skin against stone, the soft puff of exhalation with each step. I didn't look back. Looking back felt like crossing a line I couldn't uncross. Instead, I focused on reaching the platform, on the bright lights and the presence of other people. But the tunnel seemed longer than usual, stretching ahead like an optical illusion. My footsteps echoed strangely, creating harmonics that shouldn't have been possible in a straight corridor. And then I heard something that made me stumble. A voice, barely audible, speaking in time with the footsteps behind me. Almost there, almost ready, almost time. I broke into a run. Dr. Reeves agreed to see me on an emergency basis. I sat in her office, hands trembling as I played the latest recordings. She listened with growing concern, her professional composure cracking around the edges. "David, when was the last time you slept? Really slept?" "That's not important. Listen to the voice. Tell me you hear it too." She played the audio again, adjusting the volume and filtering out background noise. When the whispered words emerged clearly from the speakers, her face went pale. "This could be..." she started, then stopped herself. "Could be what?" "There are cases of extreme auditory hallucinations that become so vivid, so consistent that they begin to seem recorded. The mind can create incredibly detailed false memories, especially under severe stress and sleep deprivation." But she didn't look convinced by her own explanation. She looked scared. The messages stopped coming at 3:03 a.m. For 5 nights, my phone remained silent at that witching hour, and I began to hope that whatever had been following me had finally moved on. I even ventured back into the subway, taking short trips during peak hours when the tunnels were crowded with commuters. No footsteps, no whispered voices, just the normal chaos of urban transportation. Then, on the 6th night, my phone buzzed with a new message, not audio this time, text, from the same unknown number that had been sending the empty recordings. "Ready to meet. Tomorrow. Usual place. Come alone." The timestamp read 3:03 a.m. I stared at the message until my eyes watered, reading it over and over as if the words might rearrange themselves into something less terrifying. How did they know my usual place? Which tunnel? Which walkway? I'd used dozens of different routes over the past few months, but somehow I knew exactly where they meant. The Times Square walkway stretched before me like a concrete throat, just as it had that first night. I'd arrived at 2:30 a.m., giving myself time to prepare, to think through what I was about to do. The rational part of my mind screamed warnings about stalkers and dangerous encounters, but the part that had been living in fear for months felt only a strange sense of relief. Finally, I would have answers. I walked slowly down the tunnel, my footsteps echoing off tiled walls. The fluorescent lights flickered in their familiar rhythm, casting everything in that sickly yellow glow that made shadows seem deeper than they should be. At first, I heard nothing but my own movement. Then, as I reached the halfway point, they began. The footsteps, the whisper of skin against stone. But this time, they weren't behind me. They were coming from ahead. I stopped walking and listened. The sounds continued, growing closer. Bare feet against concrete, moving with purpose and familiarity. I reached for my phone, fingers fumbling with the camera app, but the screen remained black no matter how many times I pressed the power button. The footsteps stopped about 10 feet in front of me. I could see nothing but empty tunnel, but I felt a presence there, patient, waiting, almost curious. "Who are you?" I whispered. The answer came not as words, but as a sensation, a sudden understanding that flooded my mind like water filling a cup. I wasn't looking at someone else. I was looking at the space where someone else was looking at me. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. All those months of footsteps, of feeling watched, of messages at 3:03 a.m. I hadn't been followed. I had been following. Every night when I fell asleep, some part of me had been walking through these tunnels, tracing the same routes I took during the day. Every recording I'd made, every whispered voice I'd heard, had been my own sleepwalking self leaving breadcrumbs for my waking consciousness to find. The audio messages weren't coming from outside. They were coming from within. My sleeping mind trying to communicate with my waking one, leaving evidence of journeys I couldn't remember taking. But if that was true, then who was standing in front of me now? The presence moved closer, and I caught a glimpse of something in my peripheral vision. Not quite a reflection, not quite a shadow. Something that wore my face but wasn't quite me. Standing in a space between sleeping and waking, between following and being followed. Time to choose, it said in my voice. Stay awake forever, or learn to sleep while walking. I understood then that this had always been the choice. The footsteps, the messages, the growing closeness. It had all been leading to this moment when my conscious and unconscious selves would finally meet in the space between reality and dream. I closed my eyes and took a step forward. When I opened them, I was alone in the tunnel. But as I turned to leave, I heard something that made me smile despite everything. Footsteps behind me, 3 meters back, matching my pace perfectly. This time, I didn't look back. Looking back would mean choosing to remain divided, to keep fighting a war between the parts of myself that needed to walk in darkness and the parts that insisted on light. Instead, I walked toward the exit, my shadow self following faithfully behind, and for the first time in months, I felt complete. The audio messages still come at 3:03 a.m., but now I listen to them differently. They're not threats or warnings or proof of my deteriorating sanity. They're progress reports from the part of me that never sleeps, letting me know that the night shift is running smoothly. Sometimes I think I should be more afraid. Sometimes I wonder if I've simply found a comfortable way to be insane. But when I hear those familiar footsteps echoing behind me in the subway tunnels, I feel only gratitude. After all, everyone needs someone to walk them home, even if that someone is yourself. Story 9. The cabin settled into the mountain silence like a held breath. I'd chosen this place specifically for its isolation. No cell towers, no internet, just 40 miles of winding dirt roads between me and the nearest human being. After 18 months of deadlines and client meetings that stretched into the small hours, I needed nothing more than the sound of wind through pine needles and the crackle of burning logs. My roommate Marcus had protested the remoteness, preferring vacation spots with at least the possibility of room service, but he'd finally agreed when I offered to split the cost. Now he lay sprawled across the opposite bed, snoring softly, completely at peace in a way I envied. The man could sleep through earthquakes. I'd always been the lighter sleeper, the one who heard every settling board, every rustle in the underbrush outside, which is why, when the light came, I was the only one who saw it. The first night, I thought it was lightning. A brilliant flash filled the cabin's interior, but the light was wrong. Too blue, too pure, like someone had liquefied turquoise and set it ablaze. For perhaps 3 seconds, everything in the room became translucent. The wooden walls took on the consistency of thick glass, revealing the dark forest beyond in crystal clarity. My duffel bag became see-through, its contents floating in suspended animation. Even Marcus's body seemed to shimmer with internal light, his sleeping form ethereal and somehow distant. Then darkness returned, and I was left blinking purple afterimages, wondering if I'd dreamed the whole thing. Marcus continued snoring. I lay awake until dawn, listening for thunder that never came, watching for storm clouds through the cabin's single window. The sky remained clear, stars sharp as pinpricks in the thin mountain air. When morning arrived with its ordinary golden light streaming through ordinary wooden walls, I almost convinced myself it had been a dream. Almost. But the wall beside my bed had changed. Small irregularities dotted the pine planking, perfectly spherical indentations about the size of quarters, filled with what looked like clouded glass. Blisters, I thought, though that made no sense. Wood doesn't blister like paint. I ran my fingers over one of them, and the surface was smooth, warm to the touch, and completely solid. Marcus noticed me examining the wall while he made coffee on the cabin's ancient gas stove. When I asked if he'd seen anything unusual during the night, he laughed and said the only unusual thing was how well he'd slept. I decided not to mention the light. Not yet. The second night, the turquoise flash lasted longer, maybe 10 seconds. This time I was ready for it, sitting up in bed, watching the transformation with something approaching scientific curiosity rather than shock. The walls didn't just become transparent. They seemed to shimmer and flow like liquid glass, maintaining their shape but losing all opacity. I could see through the cabin's exterior wall to the forest beyond, where the trees themselves had taken on the same translucent quality, their bark flowing like amber resin. But it was the reflection in one of the glass blisters that made my breath catch. As the turquoise light faded, I glimpsed my own face in the curved surface, but aged decades. Deep lines carved channels around my eyes. My hair had gone completely gray, my jawline softened with age. The image lasted only a moment before normal darkness returned, but the shock of it left me trembling. I spent the next day examining every blister on the wall. There were more of them now, dozens scattered across the planking like a rash. Some remained cloudy, but others had begun to clear, becoming perfect spherical mirrors that reflected the room with unsettling clarity. When I looked directly into one, however, I saw only my current self, 34 years old and decidedly unlined. Had I imagined the aged reflection? The possibility that I was losing my grip on reality seemed almost as disturbing as the alternative. Marcus spent the day hiking while I remained in the cabin, alternately reading and watching the walls. He returned with stories of breathtaking vistas and complaints about the cell phone dead zone. I nodded and made appropriate responses, but my attention kept drifting to the blisters. Were there more of them? They seemed to multiply when I wasn't looking directly, like mushrooms sprouting in time-lapse photography. That evening, as we played cards by lamplight, I caught Marcus glancing at me with concern. When I asked what was wrong, he said I seemed distracted, jumpy. Had I been sleeping poorly? I assured him I was fine, just adjusting to the mountain air. He nodded, but I noticed him watching me carefully for the rest of the evening. The third night's light lasted nearly a minute. I had positioned myself facing the wall of blisters, determined to document what I was seeing. As the turquoise radiance filled the cabin, the wooden structure around me began its liquid transformation. This time, I noticed something new. Objects in the room were changing as well. The lamp on the nightstand appeared corroded, its brass base green with age. The cabin's furniture looked weathered and rotted, springs poking through upholstery that had deteriorated to tatters. And in the largest blister, my reflection showed a man I barely recognized. Not just aged, but haggard, hollow-cheeked, with eyes that held too much knowledge and too little hope. This version of myself moved independently, turning to meet my gaze directly, his mouth opening as if to speak words I couldn't hear. When the light faded, I was on my feet, heart hammering. The cabin looked normal again, worn but functional furniture, ordinary walls, sleeping roommate. But the blisters now covered nearly half the wall surface, some as large as dinner plates. In the morning light, they would be harder to explain away. Marcus woke as I was getting dressed, pulling on clothes with shaking hands. He asked if I was feeling all right, and I said I needed some air. The truth was, I needed to get out of that cabin before I lost what remained of my sanity. I spent the day hiking the same trails Marcus had explored, trying to tire myself enough to sleep dreamlessly. The mountain landscape was beautiful in an austere way, all granite cliffs and alpine meadows, but I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, feeling watched. The sensation was probably just paranoia, I told myself. Stress could make anyone imagine things. But when I returned to the cabin in the late afternoon, Marcus was standing outside, smoking a cigarette with hands that trembled slightly. He'd quit smoking 2 years ago. He asked me, with careful casualness, if I'd done anything to the walls. When I asked what he meant, he led me inside and pointed to the blisters. There were hundreds now, covering not just the wall beside my bed but spreading across the ceiling like a crystalline infection. Some had grown large enough to distort the room's reflection, creating a funhouse mirror effect that made everything appear warped and twisted. I told him I had no idea what could have caused them. He studied my face for a long moment, then asked if I'd been having any unusual dreams. The question hit too close to home, and I'm sure my expression gave me away. He nodded slowly and suggested we consider cutting the trip short. I agreed, but privately I wondered if leaving would help. The changes seemed to be accelerating, and I had the disturbing sense that they were following some kind of schedule that had nothing to do with our presence in the cabin. That night, I lay awake watching the ceiling, counting blisters like sheep. Marcus had taken a sleeping pill, something he'd brought just in case, and was unconscious within an hour. I envied him his chemically induced peace, but I needed to see what happened next. Some part of me had begun to suspect that the turquoise light was building toward something, that each night was a preparation for a larger event. I was right. The fourth night's light didn't flash. It arrived gradually, like a sunrise in reverse. The turquoise glow began as a faint phosphorescence in the blisters themselves, then spread outward through the walls, floor, and ceiling, until the entire cabin was suffused with that otherworldly radiance. The transformation took perhaps 10 minutes this time, slow enough for me to observe every detail. The cabin aged around me and fast forward. Wood darkened and split. Metal fixtures corroded to rust. Fabric crumbled to dust. But it wasn't just decay I was witnessing. It was the entire life cycle of objects compressed into moments. I watched the lamp cycle through years of use. Its cord fraying, its shade yellowing, its bulb burning out and being replaced by invisible hands. The floorboards warped and settled, nails working loose, gaps widening between planks. And in the largest blister, now grown to the size of a bathroom mirror, my reflection showed the progression of my own aging. I watched myself grow old in minutes, hair graying, skin wrinkling, shoulders stooping. But this version of myself wasn't passive. He was trying to communicate, pressing his hands against the inner surface of the blister, as if it were a window between dimensions. I approached the wall, drawn by a fascination that overcame my fear. As I got closer, I could see that the aged version of myself was mouthing words, his expression urgent, desperate. I pressed my own hand against the blister's surface and felt warmth that pulsed like a heartbeat. For a moment, our palms touched with only the thin membrane of glass between them. The sensation was electric, like touching a live wire, and suddenly I could hear him, hear myself, speaking in a voice cracked with age. Don't trust the light. It's not showing you the future. It's making it real. Every night you watch, you're aging inside. Leave now, while you still can. The turquoise glow began to fade, and the aged reflection pulled back, his mouth moving frantically, trying to say more. But the light was disappearing, taking with it the liquid glass walls and the corroded furniture and the impossible window into tomorrow. In seconds, the cabin returned to its normal state, leaving me standing alone in the dark, hand pressed against an ordinary wooden wall. Except the wall wasn't quite ordinary anymore. Where my palm had touched the blister, the wood felt soft, almost spongy, as if it were beginning to rot from within. I didn't sleep for the remainder of the night. Instead, I sat in the chair by the window, watching the eastern sky gradually lighten, thinking about what the reflection had said. Was I going insane, creating elaborate hallucinations to cope with stress? Or was something genuinely supernatural happening in this remote cabin? By morning, I had made my decision. Real or imagined, the experiences were becoming too intense to ignore. I would pack immediately and convince Marcus to leave with me. Whatever was happening here, I didn't want to discover where it led. But when Marcus woke, he wasn't the same person who had gone to sleep. His hair, previously dark brown, now showed distinct streaks of gray at the temples. Lines I'd never noticed before creased the corners of his eyes. He moved more slowly, as if his joints had stiffened overnight. When I pointed out the changes, he looked confused, then concerned. He examined himself in the cabin's small bathroom mirror for several minutes before emerging with a troubled expression. He couldn't explain it either, he said. Maybe it was just the mountain air. the stress of being disconnected from civilization. People sometimes look different in unfamiliar environments, but I knew better. Whatever was affecting me was affecting him too, even though he couldn't see the turquoise light. The aging process was real, and it was accelerating. We packed in silence, both of us moving with uncharacteristic urgency. As I stuffed clothes into my duffel bag, I noticed that the blisters on the walls had changed overnight. They were no longer reflective. Instead, they showed views of the cabin's interior in various states of decay. Some displayed the room as it might look in 10 years, others in 50. One showed nothing but collapsed timbers and scattered debris, nature reclaiming the structure entirely. The drive down the mountain felt like an escape from prison. With every mile we put between ourselves and the cabin, I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. Marcus seemed to relax as well, though he kept checking his reflection in the rearview mirror, touching the new lines around his eyes. It wasn't until we reached the main highway that I began to feel truly safe. The turquoise light belonged to that place, I told myself. Whatever force was behind it was tied to the cabin, trapped by geography or circumstance. Distance would protect us. I was wrong. That night, in my own apartment 200 miles away, I woke to find turquoise light seeping through the cracks around my bedroom door. My familiar walls were beginning their liquid transformation, and new blisters were forming on the surface closest to my bed. In the largest one, my reflection, decades older now, was shaking his head sadly. "Too late," he mouthed. "You've already seen too much. The light follows those who witness it. It has to. That's how it spreads." I understood then that the cabin had never been the source of the phenomenon. It had been a victim, just like whoever had stayed there before us, and whoever would come after. The turquoise light was something far older and more patient than I had imagined, something that moved from place to place, person to person, aging everything it touched in its slow hunger for time itself. As I watched the blisters multiply on my bedroom wall, I realize I have become a carrier of something beyond comprehension. Tomorrow I will call Marcus and warn him, though I suspect he is already discovering the truth for himself. And someday, when I am old and desperate and running out of time, I will find my own reflection trying to warn someone else, pressing my aged hands against the glass membrane between now and never, watching helplessly as the turquoise light claims another witness. The light is fading now, returning my bedroom to normal shadow. But I can feel it inside me, patient and growing, counting down the days until the transformation is complete. In the morning, I will notice new lines around my eyes, and the day after that, a few gray hairs. The aging will accelerate as the nights continue, each turquoise dawn bringing me closer to the hollow-cheeked figure in the glass. I have perhaps a month before I become the reflection permanently. 30 days to solve an impossible puzzle, to find a way to break a cycle that has been repeating for longer than I care to imagine. Or perhaps 30 days to find someone else to carry the light forward. The blisters on my wall are cooling, returning to their glassy sleep. But I can see my reflection in them clearly now. Not aged, not yet, but marked somehow. Changed by the knowledge of what I am becoming. In the largest blister, barely visible in the pre-dawn darkness, I can make out the faint outline of another face. Younger than mine, unfamiliar, but with the same expression of dawning horror that I must have worn that first night in the cabin. Someone else has seen the turquoise light. Someone else is beginning to understand what it means. The cycle continues, and I am no longer its victim. I am its messenger. Story 10. The ad had been too good to be true, and I should have known better. $50 a month for an attic space in a Victorian house near campus. The kind of deal that made graduate students like me suspicious of catch clauses and hidden fees. But Mrs. Henley, the elderly landlady, had simply handed me the key with arthritic fingers and mentioned only that the previous tenant had left suddenly, abandoning his security deposit. The attic accessed through a narrow staircase that creaked with each step, depositing me into a space that smelled of old wood and something else. something sweet and cloying that reminded me of developing fluid. A single dormer window provided natural light, while exposed rafters created geometric shadows that shifted throughout the day. Perfect for finishing my thesis on Gothic literature, I'd thought. The irony wasn't lost on me now. I'd moved in during the first week of October, arranging my desk beneath the window where the afternoon light was strongest. My laptop, stacks of research books, and note cards transformed the space into a scholarly cocoon. The isolation felt productive at first. No roommates, no distractions, just me and Poe's influence on Victorian supernatural fiction. The first time it happened, I'd been working late, the kind of deep focus writing session that made hours disappear. My phone's sudden vibration jolted me from a paragraph about the fall of the House of Usher, and the screen's blue glow showed 4:40 a.m. That's when I heard it, a metallic scraping sound, like hinges protesting after decades of disuse. I turned toward the sound and froze. The trapdoor in the corner, which I'd assumed was permanently sealed, had opened about 6 inches. Through the gap, I could see only darkness and the suggestion of a hallway below. The smell of developing fluid grew stronger, mixing with mustiness, and something that might have been old cologne. My rational mind supplied explanations. Old houses settled. Temperature changes affected wood and metal. The latch mechanism had probably worn down over time. I approached the opening cautiously, my bare feet silent on the worn floorboards. Kneeling beside the gap, I peered down into what appeared to be a narrow corridor, barely wide enough for a single person. The darkness seemed to pulse with its own rhythm. I grabbed my phone's flashlight and aimed it through the opening. The beam revealed faded wallpaper with a pattern I couldn't quite make out, and wooden floors that extended beyond the light's reach. No sounds came from below, no settling house noises, no creaking boards, just silence so complete it felt intentional. Using my shoulder, I pushed the trapdoor closed. It moved easily, too easily for something that had supposedly been stuck shut. The latch clicked into place with a finality that should have been reassuring but somehow wasn't. The second time, I was ready. 3 nights later, I'd positioned myself on the floor near the trapdoor at 4:35 a.m., laptop closed and attention focused. At exactly 4:40, the same metallic scraping began. This time, I watched the latch mechanism move, a slow, deliberate motion that seemed almost careful in its precision. The gap opened to the same 6 inches, revealing the same view of empty corridor. But this time, I thought I heard something. Not quite breathing, but a presence nonetheless. The kind of subtle atmospheric pressure that indicated someone nearby, holding still and listening. I whispered hello into the darkness, feeling foolish even as the word left my mouth. No response came, but the silence felt different now, expectant rather than empty. After 5 minutes, I closed the trapdoor again and returned to my desk, though concentration proved impossible for the remainder of the night. The pattern established itself over the following weeks. Every night at precisely 4:40 a.m., the trapdoor would open to its 6-inch gap. Sometimes I watched. Sometimes I buried my head under pillows and tried to ignore the scraping sound. The smell of developing fluid grew stronger each time, until it seemed to permeate the entire attic, even when the trapdoor remained closed. My thesis work suffered. Pages that should have contained analysis of supernatural elements in Victorian literature, instead filled with obsessive notes about the timing of the trapdoor openings, measurements of the gap's width, and detailed descriptions of the corridor below. I found myself researching the house's history, instead of Edgar Allan Poe's influence on Gothic fiction. The Victorian had been built in 1923 by a photography enthusiast named Edmund Marsh. He'd installed a darkroom in the basement and converted the space between floors into a storage area for equipment and supplies. Marsh had lived alone, developing photographs for the local newspaper and teaching camera techniques at the community college. In 1978, neighbors reported him missing after he failed to show up for classes. Police found no signs of struggle, no note, no evidence of where he might have gone. His darkroom equipment remained untouched, chemicals still fresh in their baths. The timing bothered me. The developing chemicals could explain the persistent smell, but why would they still be potent after nearly 50 years? And why had no one ever mentioned the corridor between floors? That's when I decided to document everything. If I was losing my mind, at least I'd have evidence of the progression. If something genuinely inexplicable was happening, I needed proof. The GoPro cost most of my remaining semester budget, but the expense felt justified. I positioned the camera on the floor, angled to capture both the trapdoor and the space below when it opened. The night vision setting cast everything in green-tinted monochrome, but the detail quality was excellent. I set it to record continuously and waited. At 4:40 a.m., the familiar scraping began. Through the viewfinder, I watched the trapdoor's slow opening, revealing the corridor in stark digital clarity. The wallpaper pattern became visible, elaborate Victorian roses that seemed to writhe in the infrared light. And then, at frame 8:47, according to the later timestamp, something appeared. An eye, vivid blue, even in the camera's green-filtered view, staring directly up through the gap. Not glimpsed or partially visible, but focused and intentional, as if someone below had positioned themselves precisely to make eye contact with the lens. The iris was so bright it seemed to glow, surrounded by whites that were too white, too perfect. The eye remained visible for exactly 11 frames, approximately half a second, before disappearing. The trapdoor stayed open for its usual 5 minutes, showing only empty corridor, before closing with its characteristic metallic scrape. I replayed those 11 frames obsessively. The eye never blinked, never moved, just stared with an intensity that made my skin crawl even through recorded footage. The color was wrong somehow. Too saturated, too vivid for human biology. And the positioning was perfect, as if whoever was below knew exactly where the camera would be placed. But the footage raised more questions than it answered. How could anyone position themselves in that narrow corridor? The space appeared barely wide enough for a person to stand upright, let alone maneuver for optimal viewing angles. And if someone was accessing the corridor from elsewhere in the house, why hadn't I heard footsteps or other sounds of movement? The photographs arrived 3 days later. Mrs. Henley had placed them on my doorstep with my monthly utility bill, mentioning that they'd been delivered to the main house by mistake. 5 black and white photographs in a manila envelope, each showing me working at my desk from an aerial perspective. The images were sharp and professional, clearly taken through the dormer window from above. An impossible angle unless the photographer had been suspended in midair or positioned on the roof. In the first photograph, I was typing on my laptop, coffee mug positioned to my right, exactly as I remembered from 2 nights earlier. The second showed me reading, head tilted at an angle that corresponded to my examination of a particularly difficult passage about supernatural symbolism. The remaining 3 captured various moments of concentration, note-taking, and research. What disturbed me most wasn't just the surveillance aspect, but the quality of the images. These weren't quick snapshots taken through glass. They were composed, well-lit, artistic in their framing. Someone had taken time to capture these moments, waiting for the right angles and expressions. The envelope bore a return address stamp from Precision Photo Lab, along with a development date of 3 weeks prior. Below that, another stamp, established 1962, serving the community since, illegible. The paper had the slightly yellowed quality of older developing chemicals, and the photographs themselves felt different from modern prints, thicker, with a subtle texture that suggested traditional film processing. But Precision Photo Lab had closed in 1978. I'd verified this during my research into Edmund Marsh's disappearance. The building now housed a convenience store, and the owner confirmed that no photo processing had occurred there for decades. The impossibility of the situation crystallized into a focus point for all my growing paranoia. Someone was watching me, photographing me, developing images at a laboratory that had been closed for nearly 50 years. The same year Edmund Marsh had vanished through the very trapdoor that now opened nightly in my rented attic. I started sleeping during the day and working at night, positioning myself where the aerial view would be blocked by the desk's angles. The trapdoor continued its nightly routine, but I no longer watched. The smell of developing fluid grew so strong that I began keeping windows open despite the October chill. My thesis advisor left concerned voicemails about missed meetings and overdue chapter drafts. Friends texted invitations I ignored. The outside world felt increasingly distant, separated from my reality by layers of impossibility and growing dread. More photographs arrived weekly, always showing the previous few days' activities from that same impossible aerial perspective. My movements around the attic, my sleeping positions on the air mattress I'd brought up to avoid the trapdoor's nightly opening, my increasingly erratic behavior as paranoia took hold. Each image was professionally composed and perfectly exposed, developed with the distinctive quality of traditional chemical processes. The photographs began including details I hadn't noticed while living them. In one image, my laptop screen was visible, showing not the thesis document I remembered working on, but a browser window open to missing persons reports from 1978. In another, the books stacked beside my desk included titles I didn't remember purchasing, volumes on photography, darkroom techniques, and Victorian spiritualism. Were these details really there, or was the developing process somehow altering the images? Had I researched Edmund Marsh's disappearance more extensively than I remembered, or were the photographs documenting activities I had no memory of performing? The line between documentation and creation began to blur. Each photograph seemed to contain elements that contradicted my memories, suggesting either that my perception of reality was severely compromised or that someone was manipulating the images during development. But manipulation required access to the original negatives, which implied that whoever was photographing me was also controlling the entire process from capture to delivery. The GoPro footage provided no additional answers. I'd continued recording nightly, capturing the trapdoor's consistent 4:40 a.m. opening, but the blue eye never appeared again. Instead, the corridor below seemed to be changing. The wallpaper pattern was definitely different. Where roses had once predominated, geometric shapes now created optical illusions that hurt to stare at directly. And the smell of developing fluid was stronger during the recordings, as if the chemical processes were happening in real time just below the floor. By November, I'd stopped pretending to work on my thesis. My laptop contained only notes about the photographs, frame-by-frame analysis of the GoPro footage, and increasingly frantic attempts to understand what was happening to me. The rational explanations had all crumbled under the weight of accumulated impossibilities. Mrs. Henley knocked on my door during the third week of November, her face creased with concern that seemed genuine, but somehow distant. She asked about my health, my sleep patterns, whether I was eating properly. Her questions felt rehearsed, as if she already knew the answers and was following a script written for situations like this. She mentioned that previous tenants had sometimes experienced adjustment difficulties with the attic space. Nothing specific, just general comments about the atmosphere and the way old houses could affect sensitive individuals. She offered to reduce my rent if I wanted to consider relocating to a ground floor room, but something in her manner suggested this was not actually an option she expected me to accept. I asked her directly about Edmund Marsh and his disappearance. Her expression didn't change, but her hands developed a slight tremor as she adjusted her glasses. She confirmed that a tenant by that name had once lived in the house, though she couldn't recall the specific circumstances of his departure. People came and went, she said. Sometimes they left forwarding addresses, sometimes they didn't. But when I mentioned the photographs and the closed laboratory, her demeanor shifted subtly. She became more alert, more focused, as if I'd finally said something she'd been waiting to hear. She asked to see the images, and I showed her the most recent ones. Aerial shots of me examining previous photographs, creating a recursive loop of surveillance documenting surveillance. Her examination of the photographs was thorough and professional, turning each image toward the light, checking the paper quality, noting the development stamps. She handled them with the familiarity of someone who understood photographic processes, which seemed inconsistent with her apparent age and background. She returned the photographs without comment, but her parting words stayed with me. Some houses hold on to their previous occupants longer than others. Edmund always said that a good photographer never really finishes his work. That night, the trapdoor opened at 4:40 a.m. as usual, but this time I heard footsteps in the corridor below. Slow, deliberate steps that seemed to circle the space directly beneath the attic. The footsteps had a strange quality, too crisp, too clear, as if they were being recorded and played back rather than produced by actual movement. I positioned myself directly over the gap and called down to whoever was below. My voice echoed strangely in the narrow space, seeming to reverberate longer than the acoustics should have allowed. The footsteps stopped immediately, replaced by that expectant silence I'd come to recognize. Then, from below, came the sound I'd been unconsciously dreading, the mechanical whir of a camera shutter, followed by the subtle whine of film advancing through a manual mechanism. Someone was photographing me from below, using equipment that matched the age and quality of the images I'd been receiving. The realization hit me with crystalline clarity. I wasn't being watched from above at all. The aerial perspective was impossible because it wasn't aerial. It was from below, looking up through a hidden lens positioned somewhere in the ceiling. The developing laboratory hadn't closed in 1978. It had simply relocated to the space between floors, where Edmund Marsh continued his work with the patience and dedication of someone who had all the time in the world. But this understanding brought no relief, only new questions that spiraled into deeper impossibility. If Edmund Marsh was still present in some form, still developing photographs using equipment and chemicals that should have deteriorated decades ago, what did that mean for my own situation? Was I documenting his activity, or was I becoming part of his collection? The most recent photographs had begun to show subtle changes in my appearance. Shadows under my eyes that were too dark, skin that appeared almost translucent in the chemical lighting, expressions that seemed more focused on something beyond the camera's range than on my supposed work. I was beginning to look like someone who belonged in a collection of vintage photographs, someone whose existence was being gradually transferred from reality to documentation. The transformation felt both gradual and inevitable. Each night the trapdoor opened to reveal more of the corridor below, as if the space was expanding to accommodate my eventual inclusion. The smell of developing fluid no longer seemed like an intrusion from elsewhere, but like the natural atmosphere of my environment. My reflection in the dormer window had started to appear differently in different lights, sometimes showing my current self, sometimes showing the person from the photographs. The boundary between the watcher and the watched was dissolving, leaving me uncertain whether I was documenting Edmund Marsh's continued presence or becoming another iteration of his endless project. The last photograph arrived on November 30th, showing me asleep on the air mattress with my face turned toward the trapdoor's gap. But in this image, the gap wasn't empty. A hand was visible, reaching up from below, positioned as if to help someone climb through the opening. The hand was pale and perfectly steady, with fingers arranged in a gesture that might have been invitation or simply documentation of another subject's transition into the collection. I stared at the photograph for hours, trying to determine whether the hand belonged to Edmund Marsh or to some future version of myself. The distinction seemed increasingly irrelevant. Whatever was happening in the space between floors operated according to rules that transcended normal temporal boundaries, where photographers and subjects, watchers and watched, could occupy the same position simultaneously. Tonight, it's 4:35 a.m., and I'm waiting for the familiar scraping sound. The GoPro is positioned to capture whatever happens next, though I'm no longer certain whether the footage will show Edmund Marsh's continued work or document my own transition into his ongoing project. The smell of developing fluid fills the attic now, as if the chemicals are working just beneath the floorboards. My laptop screen reflects my face, but the reflection looks different from the person I remember being. More focused, more patient, ready to wait as long as necessary for the perfect shot. In 5 minutes, the trapdoor will open, and I'll finally understand whether I've been documenting a supernatural presence or becoming one myself. The distinction may not matter. In Edmund Marsh's collection, subjects and photographers exist in perfect symbiosis, each serving the other's purpose in an endless cycle of observation and preservation. The scraping sound has begun. Story 11. The fluorescent lights above my station hummed with the persistence of trapped insects, casting harsh shadows that seemed to shift when I wasn't looking directly at them. 3 weeks into the renovation, and I'd grown accustomed to the restaurant's peculiar rhythms during these late-night preparation sessions. The dining room beyond the pass-through window lay shrouded in plastic sheeting and construction dust. But here in the kitchen, surrounded by gleaming steel and the familiar weight of my knife roll, I felt almost normal. Almost. I'd been hired to develop the new menu for Chez Laurent's grand reopening, a prestigious gig that should have filled me with pride. The restaurant had been shuttered for months after the previous owner's bankruptcy, but the new investors wanted to honor its legendary past while modernizing the concept. They'd given me complete creative freedom and access to the kitchen at all hours, a chef's dream scenario. Yet something about working alone in this space felt fundamentally wrong, like wearing a coat that didn't quite fit. The building itself seemed to breathe around me. Pipes groaned behind the walls with sounds that couldn't possibly be attributed to the ongoing construction. The walk-in cooler's compressor kicked on and off in irregular intervals that made me jump despite myself. And there were the smells, phantom aromas that drifted through the kitchen without source, hints of sauces I'd never prepared and herbs I hadn't touched. Tonight, I was perfecting a mushroom risotto, something elegantly simple that would anchor the appetizer section. I'd been working the rice slowly, methodically, letting each grain absorb the warm stock before adding the next ladle. The rhythm was meditative, almost hypnotic, and for a moment I forgot about the restaurant's oddities. That's when I first noticed the pot. I'd set my mise en place on the station beside the range, containers of brunoise shallots, minced garlic, grated Parmigiano Reggiano, and fresh thyme arranged in the precise order I'd learned in culinary school. But when I turned back from the stock pot, the containers had shifted. Not dramatically, just enough to break the pattern I'd established. The thyme had moved to the left side, the cheese to the center. The garlic container now sat at a perfect 45-degree angle to the cutting board. I stared at the rearranged ingredients, my wooden spoon dripping stock onto the floor. Had I moved them unconsciously? The mind plays tricks when you're tired, when you've been working alone for too many consecutive nights. I forced myself to laugh, a sound that echoed strangely in the empty kitchen, and continued stirring. But the laughter died in my throat when I realized my sauté pan had moved to a different burner. I was certain, absolutely certain, that I'd been using the front right burner. The flame had been adjusted to medium-low, the pan heating slowly to prevent the rice from burning. Now it sat on the back left burner, still warm, still containing my partially completed risotto. The original burner was cold, as if it had never been lit. My hand trembled as I reached for the pan's handle. The metal was warm, the rice still cooking properly. But that was impossible. I would have remembered moving it, wouldn't I? The silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water. Even the building's mechanical sounds seemed to have stopped, leaving only the soft bubble of simmering stock and the whisper of gas flames. I tried to focus on the familiar motions of cooking, adding stock, stirring, tasting, but my movements felt observed, evaluated. The sensation crawled across my shoulders like spider legs, that primitive awareness of being watched that had kept our ancestors alive in darker times. I glanced toward the pass-through window, but saw only plastic sheeting and shadows. The dining room renovation had left the space looking like a crime scene, tables stacked and shrouded, chairs forming ghostly silhouettes in the dim light filtering through the front windows. I told myself the feeling was natural. Anyone would feel uneasy working alone in such a place. The risotto needed another 15 minutes to reach the proper texture, so I stepped outside for air. The January night bit at my exposed skin, and I pulled my chef's coat tighter as I lit a cigarette. The restaurant sat on a quiet block of downtown, flanked by office buildings that stood empty after business hours. No traffic, no pedestrians, just the distant hum of the city's night shift. I'd researched Chez Laurent's history when I took the job, partly from professional curiosity, and partly because I'd heard whispers about its troubled past. The restaurant had been a crown jewel of the local dining scene from its opening in 1952 until the early 2000s, when a series of kitchen accidents and staff turnover began to damage its reputation. The original owner, Chef Auguste Laurent, had built his empire on exacting standards and an infamous temper that sent line cooks fleeing in tears. Laurent had died in 1959, they told me, though the details remained vague. A heart attack during service, some said. Others mentioned choking, but those stories always came secondhand, filtered through decades of restaurant gossip. What everyone agreed on was that his presence had never really left the building. Staff members through the years reported strange incidents, knives that moved on their own, recipes that appeared written in unfamiliar handwriting, the persistent feeling of being watched and judged. I dismissed such tales as typical restaurant folklore. Every old establishment had its ghost stories, usually involving deceased owners who couldn't bear to leave their life's work behind. But standing outside in the cold, staring back at the glowing kitchen windows, I felt less certain about rational explanations. The cigarette burned down to the filter, and I flicked it into the street. My risotto would be ready soon, and I wanted to finish the dish before the late hour affected my palate. But as I pushed through the kitchen door, I stopped short. Music was playing, not loudly, just barely audible above the kitchen's ambient noise, but unmistakably there. It sounded like a jazz standard from the 1940s or 50s, the kind of sophisticated background music that expensive restaurants use to cultivate atmosphere. But I hadn't turned on any music. The kitchen's sound system had been disconnected during the renovation. I followed the sound toward the pass-through window, my footsteps seeming abnormally loud on the tile floor. The music grew slightly clearer as I approached the dining room, though I still couldn't identify the specific song. It had that tinny quality of old recordings, as if it were being played through ancient speakers or drifting from a distant radio. Through the plastic sheeting, I could see nothing but shapes and shadows. The music continued, a melancholy trumpet melody that made my chest tighten with inexplicable sadness. I reached toward the plastic barrier, intending to investigate, when the sound stopped abruptly. The silence that followed felt weighted, expectant. A soft clatter from behind me made me spin around. One of my spoons had fallen to the floor beside the range, though I was certain I'd left it in the pan. The risotto bubbled innocently, exactly as I'd left it, but something about the scene looked wrong. Too perfect, too precisely arranged. I retrieved the spoon and tasted the rice. The texture was perfect, creamy but with just enough bite, exactly how I'd intended. But the flavor was different. Richer, more complex, as if someone had adjusted the seasoning while I was outside, adding depths I hadn't achieved on my own. That's when I noticed the wine. A glass of white wine sat on the counter beside my station, condensation beating on its surface as if it had just been poured. I distinctly remembered opening a bottle of Sancerre for the risotto, using perhaps a cup for the dish itself, but I hadn't poured myself a glass. I rarely drank while cooking, and never without making a conscious decision to do so. The wine was perfectly chilled, crisp and mineral bright when I sipped it cautiously. Expensive wine, better than the bottle I'd opened. I checked the label on my opened bottle. It was still the same mid-range Sancerre I'd selected, 3/4 empty as expected. So where had this glass come from? My hands were shaking now, a fine tremor that made it difficult to hold the wine glass steady. I set it down carefully and tried to focus on finishing the risotto, but my movements felt mechanical, disconnected. The familiar kitchen seemed to be watching me, evaluating my technique with unseen eyes. I plated the dish with forced precision, arranging the risotto in a perfect circle and garnishing it with fresh thyme and a drizzle of truffle oil. The presentation was flawless, restaurant quality, ready for service. But as I stepped back to admire my work, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The risotto had been shaped into a pattern, not randomly spooned onto the plate, but carefully molded into what looked like a logo or emblem. The rice formed elegant curves and flourishes that seemed deliberately designed, though I had no memory of creating such an arrangement. The pattern looked familiar, triggering a vague recognition that I couldn't quite place. I stared at the plate, trying to understand what I was seeing. The risotto logo was beautiful, professional, but completely foreign to my own plating style. I was known for clean, modern presentations, not the ornate garnishing that had been popular decades ago. Yet here was my food, my risotto, arranged in a style I'd never learned and certainly hadn't intended. The wine glass had moved again. Now it sat beside the plate, positioned as if someone had been sitting at my station, dining and drinking while I worked. A few grains of risotto clung to the rim of the glass, and when I looked more closely at the plate, I could see that someone had taken a small bite. Not a large portion, just enough to taste. to evaluate, to judge. The kitchen lights flickered once, twice, then steadied. In that brief moment of intermittent darkness, I thought I saw movement in my peripheral vision. A tall figure in white, standing beside the prep table. But when the light stabilized, I was alone. My breathing came in short, sharp gasps. The rational part of my mind scrambled for explanations. Stress, fatigue, too much caffeine, not enough sleep. I'd been working 14-hour days for weeks, pushing myself to create the perfect menu for the reopening. Maybe my mind was simply fracturing under the pressure. But the evidence was right in front of me. The rearranged mise en place, the moved pan, the mysterious wine, the tasted food, arranged in a pattern I hadn't created. I pulled out my phone and searched for images of Chez Laurent's original logo. The restaurant's website had been taken down years ago, but I found a few archived photos from newspaper articles and old review sites. When the image loaded, my phone nearly slipped from nerveless fingers. The risotto on my plate was an exact replica of the restaurant's logo from 1959. The design was intricate, stylized letters intertwined with decorative flourishes that would have been fashionable in the mid-20th century, but looked dated now. It was the kind of ornate branding that expensive restaurants use to project sophistication and European elegance. According to the archived articles, Chef Laurent had designed the logo himself, incorporating elements from his family's coat of arms. The logo had been discontinued after Laurent's death, replaced by simpler, more modern designs as the restaurant changed ownership and management over the decades. No current menu or promotional material featured this particular emblem. There was no way I could have seen it before tonight, no way I could have unconsciously recreated it in my risotto. Yet there it was, perfect in every detail, made from rice and cheese and my own unconscious hands. I backed away from the plate, my shoulder blades hitting the cold metal of the walk-in cooler. The kitchen suddenly felt smaller, the walls pressing inward like the chambers of a beating heart. The fluorescent lights hummed louder, their frequency almost matching the rapid pulse in my ears. A sound from the dining room made me freeze. The soft scrape of a chair being pulled back from a table. Then another, and another. As if invisible diners were taking their seats for service, settling in for an evening meal that existed only in memory and shadow. I forced myself to move toward the pass-through window, though every instinct screamed at me to flee. The plastic sheeting rustled in a breeze that shouldn't exist in the sealed building. Beyond the barrier, shapes moved in the darkness. Or maybe it was just my imagination, my traumatized mind projecting phantom customers onto empty space. The clinking of silverware reached my ears, soft and rhythmic, like a dinner service in full swing. Wine glasses touching in toasts. The murmur of conversation that might have been wind through broken windows, or might have been the ghosts of 1,000 elegant dinners. I thought about Chef Laurent, dying in this very space 66 years ago. Had he been proud of his restaurant in those final moments? Had he seen his life's work flash before his eyes as he choked on his last meal? Or had he been consumed with fury at leaving his creation unfinished, his standards unmet? The sounds from the dining room grew louder, more distinct. I could swear I heard the soft pop of a cork being pulled from a wine bottle, the gentle scrape of knife against china, the whispered compliments of satisfied diners. But when I pressed my face to the plastic sheeting, trying to see through to the other side, there was nothing but shadows and construction equipment. My risotto sat cooling on the plate, its elaborate logo beginning to lose definition as the rice released its moisture. But even as the individual grains settled and spread, the basic pattern remained visible. Laurent's family crest, rendered in food by hands that claimed no knowledge of its creation. I knew I should leave, pack up my knife roll, lock the door, and not return until the renovation was complete and other staff members were present. The smart thing would be to request a change of venue, to work on the menu development in my own kitchen or another restaurant space. But something kept me rooted in place, staring at that impossible plate of food. Pride, maybe, or professional stubbornness, or simply the need to understand what was happening to me, to determine whether I was losing my mind or experiencing something that defied rational explanation. The kitchen clock read 11:47 p.m. In 13 minutes it would be Thursday, and I had promised the investors a complete appetizer menu by the end of the week. I had work to finish, recipes to perfect, standards to maintain. Laurent's standards, perhaps, or my own. I picked up my knife and began to clean it methodically, the familiar ritual helping to steady my hands. Whatever was happening in this kitchen, supernatural presence or psychological breakdown, I was still a chef. I still had a job to do. The dining room fell silent, but I could feel the weight of attention pressing against my back like a physical force. Someone was watching. Someone was waiting. Someone was hungry for more than food. I reached for my notebook and began to write the evening's notes, documenting the risotto recipe with the same professional precision I'd always maintained. But as I wrote, other words began to appear in the margins, corrections and suggestions in handwriting that wasn't my own, written in the faded blue ink of an old fountain pen. The comments were in French, elegant and precise. Plus de sel, more salt. La cuisson est parfaite. The cooking is perfect. Continuez. Continue. I set down my pen with a hand that shook only slightly. The kitchen watched and waited, filled with the presence of standards that would never be satisfied, expectations that transcended death itself. Tomorrow I would return. I would cook again under those judging eyes, perfecting dishes for a reopening that might never come, pursuing an approval that could never be earned. After all, Laurent had never accepted failure, and neither, it seemed, would I. Story 12. The first time I heard the second voice, I thought my headset was picking up bleed-through from another frequency. Static crackled through my earphones as I banked the Cessna 172 into the traffic pattern at Cedar Ridge Municipal Airport, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the weathered tarmac below. The voice came through clear as a bell, repeating the tower's instruction word for word, except it told me to turn left when the tower had clearly said right. I'd been flying scenic tours out of Cedar Ridge for 3 years now, taking tourists up to see the rolling hills and farmland that stretched endlessly toward the horizon. It was peaceful work, mostly. Just me, the sky, and passengers who gasped at views they'd never see from the ground. The airport itself was nothing special. A single runway, a small terminal building that had seen better decades, and a control tower staffed by rotations of bored controllers who knew every local pilot by voice. That first day, I dismissed the conflicting instruction as equipment malfunction. Radio interference wasn't uncommon in rural areas, especially with all the agricultural equipment and power lines scattered across the countryside. I followed the tower's original command, turning right into the downwind leg of the pattern, and landed without incident. My passengers, a middle-aged couple from the city celebrating their anniversary, chatted excitedly about the flight as I shut down the engine. But the voice lingered in my mind as I secured the aircraft for the night. There had been something familiar about its cadence, though I couldn't place it. The tone carried an authority that matched the real controller, yet underneath lay an edge of urgency that made my skin crawl. The interference happened again 3 days later. This time I was alone, taking the Cessna up for a maintenance test flight after some routine work on the engine. As I called the tower for landing clearance, requesting right traffic for runway 27, both voices responded simultaneously. The official controller confirmed my request with his usual professional detachment, while the second voice, clearer now, with less static, instructed me to enter left traffic instead. Left traffic would take me over the abandoned section of the airport. Everyone in town knew about the old runway. 15 years ago, Cedar Ridge had been planning an expansion, complete with a second runway and a proper terminal building. Construction had begun on the parallel strip, and they'd even installed approach lighting and painted markings. Then came the accident. 2 Cessnas attempting to land simultaneously, one on each runway, in thick fog that had rolled in faster than anyone anticipated. The pilots, both experienced locals, had somehow become confused about which runway was which. They'd collided at the intersection where the runways would have crossed, killing all 4 people aboard both aircraft. The expansion died with them. The town couldn't stomach the idea of completing construction over what had become a gravesite. They left the unfinished runway as it was, cracked asphalt returning to weeds, rusted approach lights standing like tombstones in the overgrown grass. Insurance settlements and lawsuits had nearly bankrupted the airport, and for years afterward, people whispered about seeing lights moving along the abandoned strip on foggy nights. I'd always dismissed those stories as small-town superstition. Now, circling above that neglected stretch of concrete, I wasn't so sure. The second voice grew more insistent over the following weeks. What started as occasional interference became a regular occurrence whenever I flew the traffic pattern. The mysterious controller seemed to know my call sign, my aircraft type, even my usual flight patterns. Most disturbing of all, it had begun speaking to me directly, not just parroting the tower's instructions. During a routine training flight with a new student pilot, the voice cut through our radio communications with startling clarity. While the real controller vectored us for a standard approach, the phantom voice urged us toward the abandoned runway with increasing impatience. My student, a nervous young man named Derek, who'd been taking lessons for months, didn't seem to hear the second transmission at all. When I asked him about it, he looked at me with genuine confusion. That night I sat in the airport's small pilot lounge, nursing a cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The place was empty except for Jerry Kowalski, the evening shift controller, who'd come down from the tower for his dinner break. Jerry had worked at Cedar Ridge since before the accident, and his weathered face carried the weight of those lost years. I found myself asking him about radio interference, trying to keep my voice casual. Jerry's eyes sharpened with interest as I described the phantom transmissions, though I carefully omitted the part about being directed toward the old runway. "Funny you should mention that," he said, setting down his sandwich. "We've had a few pilots report similar things over the years. Usually happens to folks flying solo, especially in the evening hours." He paused, studying my face. "You ever hear of Tom Brennan?" The name meant nothing to me, but something in Jerry's tone made my stomach tighten. "Tom was one of the pilots in the accident," Jerry continued. "Good man, experienced flyer. He'd been instructing here for almost 20 years when it happened. Tom was bringing in a student that night. Kid was on his first solo cross-country, got caught in the weather and called for help. Tom went up in the soup to talk him down, guide him home safe." Jerry's voice grew quiet, distant. "We had both runways operational that night, the old one and the new one. Different frequencies, different approach patterns. Somehow the communications got crossed. Tom thought he was directing the kid to the main runway, but the fog was so thick." He shrugged helplessly. "Tom was still transmitting right up until impact. Keep trying to guide that boy home." The coffee turned bitter in my mouth. "The other pilot, the student, what happened to him?" Name was Michael Chen. Sweet kid, real eager to learn. Tom had been working with him for months, getting him ready for his check ride. Jerry's expression darkened. "Thing is, Michael wasn't even supposed to be flying that day. Weather had been marginal since morning, but Tom cleared him to go, said the kid needed the experience. Guess Tom figured he could always talk him through any trouble." A chill ran down my spine despite the lounge's stuffy air. "And they both aircraft were destroyed on impact. Tom, Michael, plus Tom's wife Carol, and Michael's girlfriend who'd come along for the ride." Jerry stood up, gathering his meal. "Tom never forgave himself, even in those final moments. Last thing he transmitted was an apology to Michael's family." I tried to sleep that night, but Jerry's words echoed in my head. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those abandoned runway lights standing like silent sentinels in the darkness. Somewhere around 3 a.m., I gave up on rest and drove to the airport. The place felt different in the pre-dawn hours. Emptier, more watchful. Security lights cast sickly yellow pools across the tarmac, leaving deep shadows that seemed to move when I wasn't looking directly at them. I found myself walking toward the old runway, my footsteps echoing hollowly in the still air. The cracked asphalt stretched before me, weeds pushing through every gap and fissure. The approach lights stood dark and useless, their lenses shattered by years of neglect. At the far end, where the runways would have intersected, someone had placed a simple memorial. 4 small crosses made from aircraft aluminum, names etched into the metal. Thomas Brennan, Carol Brennan, Michael Chen, Lisa Park. Standing there in the darkness, I felt watched. The sensation crawled up my spine like ice water. raising every hair on my neck. The wind picked up, whistling through the broken lights and rattling the tall grass. For just a moment, I could have sworn I heard something else on that wind. A voice calling out coordinates, altitudes, headings. Words of guidance tinged with desperation. The next day's flights passed without incident, but I caught myself monitoring the radio frequency obsessively, waiting for that familiar voice to cut through the static. When it finally came during my evening flight, I was almost relieved. Almost. This time, the second controller didn't just mirror the tower's instructions. It spoke directly to me, using my call sign with an intimacy that made my hands shake on the yoke. The voice urged me toward the abandoned runway with increasing urgency, as if time were running out for some unfinished business. Each transmission carried a weight of sorrow that seemed to press against my chest, making it difficult to breathe. I found myself banking left without conscious thought, following the phantom controller's guidance toward the dark strip of asphalt. The real tower was calling my number, asking for my intentions, but their voice seemed distant and unimportant compared to the desperate pleading in my headset. The abandoned runway grew larger in my windscreen, its cracked surface gleaming wetly in the dying light. It wasn't until I was on final approach, landing gear extended and flaps down, that rational thought broke through the strange compulsion that had gripped me. I pulled up hard, adding power and climbing away from the overgrown concrete. My heart hammered against my ribs as I realized how close I'd come to landing on a surface that hadn't seen maintenance in over a decade. The real controller's voice crackled through my headset, professional concern evident in his tone. He wanted to know if I was experiencing mechanical difficulties, if I needed assistance. I mumbled something about practicing go-arounds and requested vectors for the active runway. He guided me home with patient professionalism, never once mentioning my erratic behavior. But as I taxied to the ramp, the second voice came through one final time. It thanked me for listening, for understanding. The tone carried a note of satisfaction that chilled me to the bone, as if some important lesson had been imparted. Then it was gone, leaving only the normal chatter of airport operations. I haven't flown at Cedar Ridge since that night. The official story is that I'm taking extended leave for family reasons, but the truth is more complicated. Sometimes, late at night, I find myself driving past the airport just to look at those abandoned lights standing guard over their cracked runway. Part of me wonders if Tom Brennan is still up there, still trying to guide lost pilots safely home. Another part, the rational part, insists that guilt and suggestion had simply played tricks on my mind. But rationality offers little comfort when I remember the satisfaction in that phantom voice, the sense of a job finally completed, because I'm beginning to suspect that Tom Brennan wasn't trying to lead me to safety at all. He was trying to show me something else, how easy it is to become lost, how quickly the voices we trust can lead us astray. The abandoned runway at Cedar Ridge still waits in the darkness, and somewhere in the static between frequencies, a dead pilot continues his eternal vigil. Whether he's trying to prevent another tragedy or orchestrate one, I may never know. But I do know this. Some voices are better left unheard, and some guidance is more dangerous than flying blind. The radio in my car picks up airport traffic as I drive past Cedar Ridge each night, and sometimes, just sometimes, I hear an extra voice mixed in with the controllers and pilots. It calls out to aircraft in the pattern, offering directions with the patient authority of someone who's been doing the job for far too long. The living pilots never seem to hear it, but I listen from the darkness beyond the fence, wondering which of them will be the next to follow a voice that should have been silenced 15 years ago. After all, Tom Brennan had always been dedicated to his students. Death, it seems, hadn't changed that about him. Story 13. The first thing you learn working nights at the cell block is that old buildings remember everything. Every scream, every prayer, every desperate scratch against stone walls. It all settles into the bones of a place like sediment in still water. What they don't tell you in the employee handbook is that some memories refuse to stay buried. I've been night manager here for 8 months now, ever since they converted the old municipal jail into what the city council optimistically called a unique dining and entertainment experience. The irony wasn't lost on anyone that the same building once designed to keep people locked up now invited them in to spend their money. The original cell doors had been removed, replaced with booth seating, but the iron framework remained, painted black and polished to a dull sheen that caught the amber light from our Edison bulb fixtures. Most nights the atmosphere worked in our favor. Customers loved the novelty of drinking craft cocktails where convicted men once awaited their fate. They'd pose for selfies against the brick walls, run their fingers along the original bars, and joke about being imprisoned by our premium whiskey selection. By closing time, when the last patron stumbled out into the pre-dawn darkness, the building felt empty in the way old places do, hollow but not quite vacant. That changed 3 weeks ago. The security cameras caught it first. I was reviewing footage from the previous night, fast-forwarding through hours of nothing when I saw him. A figure in what appeared to be a pinstripe suit, moving through the main corridor with deliberate measured steps. The timestamp read 02.1007. I rewound and played it again, leaning closer to the monitor. The man walked the length of the hall, pausing at each former cell as if conducting an inspection. He carried something in his right hand, a cup or mug that remained perfectly level despite his movement. What struck me most was his posture, shoulders back, head held high, moving with the authority of someone who belonged there, someone who owned the space. I checked the timestamps on all 6 cameras. The figure appeared on each one at exactly 02:10, following what seemed to be a predetermined route through the building. The strangest part was how the cameras themselves behaved around him. The feed would flicker and distort, static creeping in from the edges of the frame whenever he drew near. On camera 4, positioned over what had been the maximum security wing, the image went completely dark for 17 seconds. When it returned, the man was gone. I told myself it was a technical glitch. Old wiring in an older building. The previous week, we'd had issues with the ice machine cutting out and the draft beer taps losing pressure. Buildings settle, systems fail, and night shifts make you see things that aren't there. I'd learned that working security at a casino years earlier. The graveyard hours play tricks on your mind, especially in places where human misery has soaked into the walls. But the next night, I watched the live feeds at 02:10. Camera 1 showed the main corridor, empty except for shadows cast by the overhead lighting. Then, between one frame and the next, he was there. Not walking into view, not emerging from a doorway, simply present, as if materiality was optional for him. My breath caught in my throat as I watched him begin his slow procession past the converted cells. The image quality degraded almost immediately, pixels dancing across the screen like television snow. I switched to camera 2, which covered the eastern wing. The feed was clear until exactly 02:12, when the same atmospheric disturbance began. Static crawled across the monitor, and through the interference, I could make out the figure's outline moving with that same methodical pace. He paused at cell 7, now a booth popular with our younger customers, and seemed to peer inside, though I couldn't make out his features through the visual noise. My hands trembled as I reached for the radio to call Tom, our security guard, but hesitated. What would I say? That I was watching a ghost make his rounds? That the cameras were malfunctioning in perfect synchronization with a figure that shouldn't exist? Instead, I grabbed my flashlight and headed downstairs. The main floor felt different at night. During business hours, conversation and music filled the space, making it feel alive and welcoming. After closing, with only the emergency lighting casting long shadows between the booth seats, the building's original purpose reasserted itself. The air hung heavy and still, carrying the faint scent of industrial disinfectant that never quite masked the underlying mustiness of old stone and metal. I made my way toward the eastern wing, my footsteps echoing off the brick walls. The temperature seemed to drop as I approached the area where camera 2 had lost signal. My breath began to miss slightly, visible in the pale beam of my flashlight. I told myself it was the HVAC system cycling down for the night, but the explanation felt thin. Cell 7 sat empty, its booth cushions casting strange shadows in the dim light. I swept my flashlight beam across the space, looking for any sign of disturbance. Everything appeared normal. salt and pepper shakers in their proper positions, laminated menus stacked neatly by the wall. But as I turned to leave, something caught my eye. On the metal framework where the original cell door had been mounted, a thin film of condensation had formed. Not unusual in itself, but the moisture had taken a specific shape. Handprints, as if someone had gripped the bars from the inside. I reached out to touch the condensation, and it was ice cold, far colder than the ambient temperature could account for. From somewhere behind me came a sound that made my blood freeze, the soft tink of porcelain against metal, like a cup being set down on a hard surface. I spun around, flashlight beams slicing through the darkness, but found only empty space. The sound repeated from a different direction, somewhere near the maximum security wing. I followed it, moving as quietly as possible on the concrete floor. The acoustics in the old jail played tricks with sound. Conversations from one end of the building could carry clearly to the other, while sounds right next to you might seem to come from somewhere else entirely. But this was different. Each soft impact seemed deliberate, placed, as if someone was marking time or maintaining a rhythm only they understood. As I approached the maximum security wing, my flashlight began to flicker. I tapped it against my palm, a reflexive gesture that accomplished nothing. The beam steadied for a moment, then died completely. In the absolute darkness that followed, I heard footsteps. They came from ahead of me, measured and unhurried, moving in the direction I'd been traveling. The sound of leather soles on concrete, punctuated by that same soft porcelain on metal tink. I fumbled for my phone, activating its LED light, but the weak illumination barely penetrated the gloom. What I saw in that pale glow stopped my heart. The corridor ahead of me was lined with cell doors. Proper doors, not the booth seating that had replaced them months ago. Heavy steel barriers with small observation windows, exactly as they would have appeared decades earlier. My rational mind screamed that this was impossible, that I was experiencing some kind of breakdown, but my eyes insisted on what they were seeing. The footsteps had stopped, but I could sense a presence nearby, patient and watchful. The air grew thick, almost viscous, making each breath an effort. I tried to step backward, to retreat to the main corridor where reality followed familiar rules, but my feet wouldn't move. It was as if the building itself had decided I belonged here, in this space between past and present. Then I heard breathing that wasn't my own. Slow, deliberate inhalations, followed by measured exhalations. Someone was standing just beyond the reach of my phone's light, observing me with the same attention I'd imagine a guard might pay to a potentially dangerous prisoner. The sensation of being evaluated, cataloged, filed away for future reference. I forced myself to speak, though my voice came out as barely a whisper. "Who's there?" The breathing stopped. In the silence that followed, I became aware of other sounds. Distant voices, indistinct but clearly agitated. Somewhere in the darkness, people were arguing, pleading, demanding to know when they would see a lawyer or a judge, or anyone who might listen to their protests of innocence. The voices seemed to come from behind the impossible doors that lined the corridor, as if the cells were occupied once again. My phone's light began to dim, the battery apparently draining at an accelerated rate. In the growing darkness, I saw movement, a tall figure in what appeared to be a well-tailored suit, standing perfectly still, about 10 feet away. He held a cup in his right hand, raised to his lips as if taking a sip, though I couldn't see his face clearly enough to confirm the action. We regarded each other for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then, without any transition I could perceive, I was standing alone in the modern corridor, surrounded by booth seating and decorative lighting. The cell doors were gone, replaced by the familiar restaurant fixtures. My flashlight worked perfectly, casting a steady beam across surfaces that were exactly as they should be. I stumbled back to the security office, my hands shaking so badly I could barely operate the door handle. The monitors showed empty corridors on all cameras. Timestamp reading Dotu 47. No sign of the figure, no atmospheric disturbances, no technical difficulties. Just an ordinary night in an ordinary building that happened to have an extraordinary past. But when I checked the recordings the next morning, they told a different story. Camera 2 showed clear footage of me entering the eastern wing at 2:16, sweeping my flashlight beam across the empty booths. At 02:23, I appeared to stop suddenly, directing my light toward cell 7 and standing motionless for nearly 3 minutes. Then, without any visible cause, I backed away rapidly and disappeared from frame. What the camera didn't show was the condensation handprints I'd seen, or the impossible doors, or the figure in the pinstripe suit. According to the recording, I'd simply walked into an empty corridor, stood around looking confused, and left. The behavior of someone experiencing a mental health crisis, not a supernatural encounter. I began staying later each night, telling myself I was conducting a thorough investigation of what I now thought of as the incident. I reviewed every frame of security footage from the past month, looking for other anomalies. I found them, subtle things that I'd previously dismissed as technical glitches. Shadows that moved independent of any light source, brief power fluctuations that affected only certain sections of the building, temperature variations that followed no logical pattern. The figure appeared again 6 nights later, following the same route at exactly 02:10. This time, I was ready for him. I positioned myself in the main corridor, well back from his projected path, and waited. When he materialized, and there was no other word for how he simply became visible, I observed him with the detached interest of a scientist studying a laboratory specimen. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with dark hair slicked back in a style that suggested the 1940s or early 50s. His suit was impeccably tailored, the pinstripes sharp and precise. He moved with the confidence of absolute authority, someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. The cup he carried appeared to be made of white porcelain, decorated with a simple blue pattern around the rim. What struck me most was his purposefulness. This wasn't a random haunting or a confused spirit replaying traumatic memories. He was conducting business, following a routine that had meaning and importance to him. At each former cell, he would pause, peer inside as if checking on an occupant, and make a small notation in what appeared to be a logbook tucked under his left arm. I tried to follow him, maintaining what I hoped was a respectful distance. As he moved deeper into the building, toward areas that had once housed the most dangerous prisoners, the air grew thick and oppressive. My breathing became labored, and my vision started to blur around the edges. It was like trying to operate at high altitude, where oxygen was precious, and every step required conscious effort. He paused at the end of the maximum security wing, in front of what had been solitary confinement. In our current incarnation, the space served as a wine storage room, lined with climate-controlled cases holding our premium selections. But as I watched, the modern fixtures seemed to fade, becoming translucent and insubstantial. Behind them, like a double-exposed photograph, I could see the original cell, a concrete box barely large enough for a cot and a toilet. The figure opened his logbook and made a careful entry with what appeared to be a fountain pen. Then he looked directly at me. His eyes were the pale blue of winter sky, cold and completely without emotion. They held the kind of authority that comes from years of absolute power over other human beings. The gaze of someone who had decided the fate of countless individuals and lost no sleep over his decisions. When he looked at me, I felt catalogued, assessed, and found wanting. He closed the logbook with a soft snap and tucked it back under his arm. Then he raised the porcelain cup to his lips and took a deliberate sip, never breaking eye contact. The message was clear. He knew I was there, knew I was watching, and wanted me to understand that I was in his domain now. Whatever authority I might have during business hours, the nights belonged to him. I tried to speak, to ask who he was or what he wanted, but no words came. The air had become too thick, too resistant to sound. All I could do was stand there, pinned by that Arctic stare, while he finished his inspection and his coffee. Then, between one heartbeat and the next, he was gone. Not walking away, not fading gradually, simply absent. The oppressive atmosphere lifted immediately, leaving me gasping like a drowning man who'd suddenly broken the surface of deep water. The wine storage room was exactly as it should be, filled with modern cooling units and organized inventory. I found myself questioning everything after that encounter. During the day, surrounded by staff and customers, The incident seemed like a stress-induced hallucination. The rational explanation was obvious. Working alone in an old building with a traumatic history had triggered some kind of psychological episode. The mind creates what it expects to see, especially in environments associated with fear and suffering. But the nights told a different story. The figure continued his rounds, appearing at 0210 with clockwork precision. Sometimes I watched from the security office. Sometimes I attempted to follow him through the building. The results were always the same: brief glimpses of an impossible past superimposed over the present, followed by his acknowledgement of my presence and his eventual disappearance. I began researching the building's history, spending my days off at the city library and the historical society. What I learned didn't comfort me. The municipal jail had operated from 1923 to 1987, housing everyone from petty thieves to murderers awaiting execution. The warden during its most troubled period was a man named Charles Whitmore, appointed in 1943 and serving until his retirement in 1978. Whitmore had been known for his rigid discipline and unwavering routine. He conducted personal inspections every night at precisely 0210, carrying a cup of coffee and a leather-bound logbook where he recorded his observations. Former employees described him as a man who never forgot a face or forgave a transgression, someone who took his responsibilities so seriously that he rarely left the building except on official business. He had died in 1982, 4 years after retirement, found in his small apartment with a cup of coffee growing cold on the table beside him. The obituary mentioned his dedication to duty and his belief that proper supervision was the key to maintaining order among the criminal population. The photograph accompanying the obituary showed a tall man in a dark suit standing behind his desk in the warden's office. He was holding a porcelain cup decorated with blue flowers, the same cup I'd seen night after night in the security footage. I showed the photograph to Tom during one of our shift changes, asking casually if he'd noticed anything unusual during his rounds. He studied the image with the careful attention of someone who understood that his answer might have consequences. "Looks familiar," he said finally. "Reminds me of that guy I sometimes see in the hallway around 2 in the morning. Always figured it was shadows playing tricks, you know. Old buildings are like that." So I wasn't alone in seeing him. The knowledge should have been comforting, but instead it raised more disturbing questions. If multiple people were experiencing the same phenomenon, was it really a shared delusion? Or was Charles Whitmore somehow continuing his duties decades after death, unable or unwilling to accept that his watch had ended? The answer came last Tuesday night, when I finally worked up the courage to speak to him directly. I positioned myself in the main corridor at 0205, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing my best suit, a gesture of respect that felt both ridiculous and necessary. When he materialized at exactly 0210, I stepped forward and cleared my throat. "Mr. Whitmore," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "Charles Whitmore. I'm the night manager here." He stopped mid-stride and turned to face me fully. Up close, his features were sharp and aristocratic, carved from the same unforgiving stone as the building itself. He looked me up and down with professional assessment, taking in my clothing, my posture, my credentials for being in his domain at his hour. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "You're not on my roster, son. This is a restricted area during inspection hours." "The building is a restaurant now," I explained, though the words felt absurd even as I spoke them. "It has been for several months. There are no prisoners here anymore." His expression didn't change, but something flickered behind those pale eyes. Confusion, perhaps, or denial. He glanced around the corridor, taking in the booth seating and decorative lighting that had replaced his familiar cell doors. For a moment, his certainty wavered. "Temporary modifications," he said finally. "Administrative efficiency measures. The fundamentals remain unchanged. Order must be maintained, protocols must be followed, and proper supervision must be provided for all individuals under departmental authority." He raised his cup to his lips and took another sip, the gesture serving to restore his composure. When he lowered it, his gaze had hardened into something approaching hostility. "Your presence here during inspection hours is irregular," he continued. I'll need to see your authorization and review your personnel file. Until then, you're to restrict your movement to approved areas and report any unusual activity immediately." I realized then that he genuinely didn't understand what had happened. In his perception, he was still the warden of an active correctional facility, still responsible for maintaining order among a population of dangerous criminals. The restaurant, the customers, the modern world, none of it registered as real to him. He was trapped in a loop of duty and routine, unable to process any information that contradicted his fundamental understanding of his role. "Mr. Whitmore," I said gently, "what year do you think it is?" The question seemed to physically pain him. He gripped his coffee cup tighter, his knuckles white against the porcelain. That's an irregular question. Personnel are expected to maintain awareness of current date and time as part of basic competency requirements. "It's 2024, I told him. "The jail closed in 1987. You retired in 1978 and died in 1982. The building has been converted to a restaurant." For a moment, his entire form seemed to flicker, like a television image struggling with poor reception. The confident authority drained from his posture, replaced by something approaching panic. He looked around the corridor again, seeing it clearly for perhaps the first time in decades. "That's impossible," he whispered. "There are procedures to follow, protocols. The prisoners require supervision. If I'm not here, who's maintaining order? Who's ensuring compliance with departmental regulations?" The desperation in his voice was heartbreaking. Here was a man so defined by his responsibilities that death itself couldn't release him from duty. He was trapped not by some external force, but by his own inability to accept that his watch had ended. "The building is safe," I assured him. "There's security, proper supervision. Your job is done. You can rest now." He shook his head violently, coffee sloshing in his cup but never spilling. "Unacceptable. Administrative personnel cannot abandon their posts without proper transfer of authority. I have no documentation authorizing cessation of duties. Until such documentation is provided, I remain responsible for all individuals within this facility." And there it was, the heart of his torment. Charles Whitmore couldn't move on because no one had ever officially relieved him of duty. In his rigid, bureaucratic mind, he was still bound by the terms of his employment, still answerable to superiors who had long since passed away themselves. He was a prisoner of his own sense of obligation, condemned to endless rounds in a jail that existed now only in his memory. I've been thinking about that conversation for the past week, and I've reached a disturbing conclusion. Charles Whitmore sees me as one of his prisoners now. Every night when he conducts his inspection, he pauses outside the security office where I sit watching the monitors. He makes a notation in his logbook, recording my presence and behavior like any other inmate under his supervision. The really unsettling part is that I'm starting to understand his perspective. I arrive at the same time every night, follow the same routines, remain within the confines of the building until morning. From his point of view, I'm just another individual requiring supervision and assessment. The fact that I leave each morning doesn't register. Perhaps he interprets it as a transfer to work detail or some other administrative function. Last night I found a manila folder on my desk that hadn't been there when I left the previous morning. Inside was a handwritten evaluation form, filled out in the precise script I'd observed in Whitmore's logbook. My name was at the top, followed by an employee number I'd never seen before. The assessment was thorough and professional, noting my compliance with facility schedules and appropriate deference to administrative authority. At the bottom, in red ink, was a single word: approved. I don't know what I've been approved for, and I'm afraid to find out. But I know I'll be back tonight, same as always, sitting in my office while Charles Whitmore makes his rounds. Because maybe he's right about one thing. Maybe the building does require supervision, just not in the way he imagines. Maybe I'm not the night manager of a restaurant built in an old jail. Maybe I'm just another prisoner who hasn't realized he's been sentenced yet. And maybe, somewhere in the darkness between past and present, Charles Whitmore is still the only one who understands the true nature of this place. The coffee in my cup has gone cold while I've been writing this, but I can't bring myself to take a sip. Because I'm starting to understand that once you accept refreshment from the warden, You're acknowledging his authority over you, and I'm not sure I'm ready to make that admission yet. The clock on my desk reads 0209,